Our guest tonight is Brian Watson, who is a community worker in Belfast. He's been doing it for about 20 years. He was born in Belfast on the Lower Shankill Road, which is the most deprived Protestant neighborhood in Belfast. The community has some of the highest unemployment. It has one of the highest crime rates. It's an area where most kids have dropped out of school. Many kids, I'm not sure if I'd say most. Brian was telling me earlier that he's talked to some kids who were 20, 21 years old who couldn't write a sentence, had never really even learned how to read and write. And we're talking about really, really high poverty rates. So the area where Brian was born in the Lower Shankill Road is an area that needs help more than perhaps any Protestant community in all of Belfast. He's a community development officer for the Belfast Conflict Resolution Consortium. His work is to work along the peace line. And as you know, the peace line is the areas where the walls are. 25-foot walls where people on either side have never, ever known someone from the other side, never had a decent conversation with someone of an opposing religious tradition. The major goal that Brian has is to bring Belfast into becoming a post-conflict society where people no longer think of each other in terms of their religious traditions, but begin to talk to each other as human beings. Brian has a degree in marketing and communications from the University of Ulster. He holds many certificates in mediation, conflict resolution, community relations, negotiations. And this is my commentary on him. If there's ever anyone in Belfast who has their finger on the pulse of what's going on, it's Brian Watson. So that's a tall order for you to live up to. Let's start out with a question from me, and then as time goes on, I'll open the floor for questions from you. First of all, Brian, tell us a little bit about the Lower Shankill, what the community is like, what kinds of people live there, what the problems are that you've encountered there.
Well, first of all, it's a small community. The population of it would be less than 2,000, about 874, I think, households. The vast majority of them, which is social housing, so they're owned by either the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, people pay rent, or they're owned by housing associations. The actual rate of owner occupiers in the area is very small. Bill said it's the most deprived Protestant area in Northern Ireland. It's the actual second most deprived overall. It's the most deprived in terms of, for example, educational achievement. As Bill rightly said, we would have a high percentage of young people who just basically haven't even mastered the basic literacy skills. There's very, very high unemployment. We'd be looking now into maybe third generation unemployment. In years gone by, the Protestant population used to work largely in heavy industry. We used to have a lot of heavy industry. We had shipbuilding, with aircraft building, we had the rope works. And the Protestant working class would basically work in there as tradespeople, fitters, welders, scaffolders, or whatever. And those are the days before fair employment. So you basically followed your father into these jobs. And there was no interviews or whatever. In Belfast parlance, it was, you got to start. And your father would come home Sunday and say, right, you're leaving school on Friday, son. You're starting an apprenticeship as a fitter on Monday. Most of these heavy industries were predominantly Protestant. And we had this ready outlet for employment. We have no heavy industry now. The shipyard, Harn the Wolves, where my father worked at one stage, was the biggest shipyard in the world, employed about 35,000 people. Now there are probably about maybe less than 200-300 people just basically doing maintenance work. The rope works have closed down, Mackey's have closed down, the Sirocco works have closed down. So these are the people now who don't have that outlet, and they don't have any education. And worse than that, actually, there's probably in the area there's not a great value put in education. So unemployment rates are very, very high, poverty rates are very high, health suffers from very, very, very poor health. We did a survey 3 years ago on men's health, people aged over 50, and it was scary. And the life expectancy of the average man who lives in the Lower Shankill is probably about 12 years less than the rest of Northern Ireland. So it's an area of multiple deprivation. It's also been decimated over the years by very, very badly planned regeneration. At one time, the Greater Shankill area would have had a population of probably close on 65, 70,000. Now it's down to under 22,000. A lot of that was to do with the Troubles. We had more than our fair share of Troubles in West Belfast during the conflict of the last 35 years. A lot of people moved out. But on top of that as well, we had this very bad, very, very poorly planned regeneration where the housing executive and the government departments would have moved people out of out of Belfast to live in places like Bangor, Carrickfergus, Lisburn, which are maybe about a 10, 12-mile radius out of Belfast. But they never replaced house for house. You know, where there were maybe a street of 12 houses, they built 4, they built 6, and these people never come back in again. So if you took that as a canvas, that A4 sheet, as a canvas of the area of the Lower Shankill, you could probably rehouse the entire population at the moment in about a quarter of that. We've had campaigns now to try and get people to come back, homecoming. But when people move out of the area and they settle and their kids go to schools in other areas and they build up a life and a lifestyle for them, it's very, very difficult to do that. One of the other problems we have, and planners who don't know Belfast would probably look upon this as an asset, but we have vast areas of unused land in the Lower Shankill, green spaces and brown spaces. And this is probably unique in any city in Britain, Ireland, or probably Europe, that you'd have so much space so close to the city centre, which in normal times would be very, very valuable land. And what we have basically, as a community worker in Dublin described it, is you have poor people in rich land, you have poor people living so close to the city centre. Belfast city centre is expanding at a rapid rate, and the only way, really, the only outlet for this expansion is up in West Belfast. So we try not to be conspiracy theorists, but we wonder at times if the government's plan is basically to try and wipe out the Lower Shankill, get rid of the poor people, house them somewhere else, and turn over the Lower Shankill, either as a means of servicing the expanding city centre or for the uppies, the people who work in the city centre. The area itself, in the last census, and funny enough, there's a census on at the moment, but I think it was 94% Protestant. What the other 6 is a mystery to me. I've never found anybody in the Lower Shankill before who wasn't a Protestant. So the other 6%, whoever they are, they're keeping their heads well down. It was an area that was very, very badly affected by what we call, or what people refer to as the Troubles. As was said in the bill, I have a bit of a problem with this term, the Troubles, because I don't think it does justice to what was basically a bloody war. I mean, we would talk about having a bit of a trouble with a neighbour, playing music at night, or having a bit of trouble with my stomach this morning after all the drink I got at Jack's house. So the Troubles doesn't really do it justice. It was a bloody sectarian war. But for the sake of tonight, we'll simplify things and we'll keep it as the Troubles. So we had the Troubles and the impact that had basically on the population. And then we had in 2000 and 2003, pardon me, we had 2 internal loyalist paramilitary feuds. One was between the 2 main groups, which would be the Ulster Defence Association, the UDA, and the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF. And then the second one was an internal one with factions within the UDA. That caused a lot more population movement.
What were the issues of that, Brian?
The second one, which was probably the most bloody one, there was an individual called Johnny Adair who was the leader of the UDA at the time. And the UDA as an organisation, it's a very democratic organisation. It has 6 basic leaders, and he was the commander of the UDA in West Belfast. And I think he came from the Lower Shankill. He had visions of taking over the whole organisation. But what actually started it, what kick-started it was they had organised a festival in 2003, and as part of that festival, a few people come onto the stage dressed in combat gear and balaclavas and fired off a few rounds into the sky. But worse than that, the UVF had a bit of a fallout with one of their factions in Mid-Ulster a few years earlier. And there was a character called Billy Wright who was shot dead in prison by the INLA, which is one of the other Republican factions. and he had been he'd been basically told by the UVF to leave the country, and he took it upon himself not only not to leave the country, but to form a rival organisation called the LVF, the Loyalist Volunteer Force, which was a smaller organisation. It was based mainly around Mid-Ulster. That would be areas like Portadown and Lurgan. You can look those up on the map, they're not too hard to find. As I said to Bill earlier, that there's really probably in the paramilitary world, there's no more bitterness or hatred than old comrades who have fallen out. So immediately Billy Wright decided A, not to leave Ulster, and B, to form his own paramilitary group. He was at loggerheads with the UVF. They became vicious enemies.
But it proves that you're not even safe in prison, because he was shot and killed while in prison.
He was shot dead in prison. So basically, as part of this festival, Johnny Adair had formed links with the LVF and had appeared down at a few of their rallies and so forth. And during this festival, they had a parade up the Shankill Road, and he invited members of the LVF to come up and take part in this parade. And they were carrying LVF banners. And as they walked past a bar, the Rex Bar, which is a very well-known UVF bar in the Shankill Road, a bit of a fight started. Someone ran out, grabbed their banners. The next thing, fisticuffs. And then shortly after that, shots were actually fired into the bar. And then that sparked off the feud. And the feud lasted for quite a while. And basically, at that time, there would have been UVF personnel living within the Lower Shankill, just as there probably would have been UDA personnel living in the Mid and Upper Shankill, which was basically UVF territory. A lot of those people were put out of their homes, were put out at gunpoint. There were a number of people killed, there were quite a few people displaced. So the whole thing was a cumulative effect of bad regeneration, the Troubles, two paramilitary feuds, just a history and if not valuing education. And basically all this came together in a cumulative effect. And that's what we have today with the Lower Shankill as a very deprived, marginalised and disconnected community. During the feud and so forth, the local population kept their head down. They went home at night, they locked the door, and they didn't dare put their head above the parapet. So when peace broke out and Johnny Adair and his cohorts were put out of the area, I think he's now holed up in Scotland, we started to try and build the community confidence and the community cohesion again. And it was very difficult. It was a very, very slow process because people were there was a lot of mistrust and suspicion still in the area, and people were very reluctant to come out and come together and try and campaign together and join residents groups and human rights groups and so forth. But it's changing, and it's a much more vibrant place now than it was 7 or 8 or 9 years ago. And there's a lot more collective action, there's a lot more people becoming involved and campaigning in the area. And also, for the first time in quite a while, we have a waiting list for housing in the Lower Shankill. And I think that's a good barometer of just how the area has sort of improved over the last 7 or 8 years. It's never dull, the other thing.
Tell us a bit about your parents and how they conducted themselves in the household, and were you aware of the differences between the two communities as a young boy?
Yeah. I was brought up just outside Belfast, probably about 10 miles out of it, which to you people here probably means just a slight walk down the road, but believe me, in Northern Ireland, 10 miles is quite a distance. Very average household, just my sister and myself. My father worked in Harland and Wolff's, the shipyard, and my mother stayed at home and kept the house and brought up a family. And that's what happened in those days. Women very, very rarely worked. Protestant household, the place we lived in was probably, I would say, 80% Protestant. Our family was never really religious, and there was no great political opinions expressed in the family. My mother, of the two of them, probably would have been had more of a bent towards religion. My father really didn't care much about it. My early relationship with religion was not good because on a Sunday, my mother used to pack my sister and myself off to church and Sunday school. And I remember it was the white shirt, the school tie, the blazer, hair combed, face washed. And I hated every minute of it. It was as boring as hell. I mean, it really was boring. And it was bad enough having to go to Sunday school, but after Sunday school you hung around, had a few cigarettes at 6 years of age, around the back of the church, and then and then into church for another session. So basically I looked upon Sunday as a waste of time. It was boring, and it just killed your Sunday basically. And I've never really got over that. But the thing it's affected me ever since, truth be told. But we were sitting talking the other day with Bill, and there were a few incidents that I do remember. It's probably worth telling. It's nothing really to do with the troubles in Northern Ireland, but just it's the mindset, the religious mindset. As I say, I was bunged off to Sunday school, and I remember once deciding I had enough of this. I really had enough of it, and I went to my mother and tried to reason with her and said, "Look, this is wrong. I hate it. I'm bored with it. A lot of my friends don't go to Sunday school. Why do you make me do this when you don't go to church?" Or Sunday school, obviously Sunday school or church, and my mother really wasn't into principled negotiation, and you just got a crowd around the back of the ear and told, do what you're told, basically. The other thing that sticks in my mind at the time, and it sort of brought the class issue to me, was that I suppose most churches over here as well, you have a collection at church, free will offering, and all of the families got little envelopes, and you put your money into it. It's the same over here probably, and they were all numbered and not related back to each family. But what really got to me was at the end of the year they published how much each family had given, and not only did they publish it, they put it in ranking order, right down to the bottom, from the top to the bottom. I remember coming up to the end of each year, my mother used to be frantic, and she was down the back of the sofa and down into cupboards trying to get extra money to get into the envelope so we wouldn't appear in the bottom half, because once you appeared in the bottom half of that list, you were doomed. That was it. You were doomed. And the other thing again, which brought home the class thing, was when we did go to church, a couple of cousins and myself and a couple of mates, we would normally hide out at the back of the church where you could eat sweets and not really be seen. But for some Sunday, and for the like of one Sunday, and for the like of me, I can't remember why, but we ended up in the biggest pew in the church, right at the very top of the church. And this was the family pew of a very, very wealthy and influential family who owned a large linen mill in the town. And Sir John was, I think, the deputy leader of the Unionist Party. They really were the old aristocracy. And this was their pew. And they had a ritual. They wouldn't come in with the rest of the peasants, and sit down in church. They had a ritual whereby they would make a grand entrance halfway through the first hymn. And this happened every Sunday. The doors would open and the family would walk in ascending order. So John would be at the front and his wife, and then his family who were growing up, and the grandchildren, all little steps and stairs. And they would walk up to their pew, and they would all go and sit in their pew, and they'd have a wee pious moment, pious moment, talking to God. And then they joined in the rest of the service. As I say, for this Sunday, and again, for the life of me, I have no idea how we ended up in their family pew, but it probably wasn't one of our better ideas, because they had, true to form, the doors opened halfway through the first hymn, family paraded in, ascending order, and they walked up to where we were sitting and they stopped, and Sir John took a sort of a 90-degree turn, and he looked at us, and he just did a complete 180-degree turn and pointed to the door. And the whole family did an about turn. It was like a military manoeuvre. And they marched out of the church. And it was like one of those things you would see in the movies where the organist suddenly stopped playing, and all the onward Christian soldiers. I thought, Jesus, we were in trouble here. We better make a boat for it. So on the last note of the last hymn, we made a boat for it, but we weren't quick enough. And I think it's called the Verger or something like it's nabbed us just before we could get out of the church and started to lecture us about how dare we do this. We've insulted Sir John, and we're going to go to hell and burn, and crucify and whipped and all the rest of it. And the minister came down, and this was one of the few ministers that I had any time for. He was a Welshman called Islay New Pritchard. And one of the reasons I liked him so much was that I was doing English literature at the time, what we called O-levels, and we were doing Dylan Thomas. Have you ever heard of Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet? And I think it was Under Milkwood and Hunchback in the Park. And this minister had gone to school and grown up with Dylan Thomas, and he used to coach us on it. And he was a tremendous character. But unlike most Presbyterian ministers, he smoked, and he was quite fond of a gin and tonic. And in those days, Presbyterian ministers didn't do that sort of thing, but he smoked. Not only did he smoke, he didn't even wait till he got out of the church, he just lit the fag and away he went. So your man had us by the scruff of the neck, you know, threatening hellfire and brimstone, and we were going to have to go and sackcloth and ashes and apologise to Sir John. And the Reverend came out and lit the cigarette, and what's going on here? And he said, you don't see what happened. They've insulted Sir John. I mean, I don't know how we're ever going to recover about this. And he just, well, he said if St John was coming to church for the right reasons, he'd sit in the steps, let them go. So, 3 weeks later, he was back in Wales. He got sacked. I think in hindsight, we probably didn't return. It's a good term. We had, as I say, the town we were brought up in was quite small at the time, about 80% Protestant. I had Catholic friends. In fact, one of my best friends at the time, Kieran, was Catholic, and we played together. We hung out together. We played football together. We went and fished together. You know, we went swimming together. He was part of our gang, a couple of other ones. But he went to a different school. He went to a different primary school from us, or from the rest of our gang, and he went to a different secondary school, and he belonged to different youth groups. So whereas it wasn't actually an issue as such, we were always aware of difference. We were aware that somehow we weren't really sure what Catholics did, you know, funny things that blessed themselves. Tended to go to church more than we did, and tended to be a bit more pious than we were. But really we didn't know much about them, but we were aware of difference. We were aware of difference.
What changed that from the time you just saw them as being different from the time when they became the enemy?
The enemy.
Or is that a fair statement to make?
Yes, yes, yes it is. Life went on like this. Life was hunky-dory. But as we went through the 60s, the pot started to boil a wee bit. Troubles. The Reverend Ian Paisley, who I'm sure you've heard of, come onto the scene with his sort of hellfire and brimstone brand of Presbyterianism. And what the Reverend Ian did is he formed his own church. The difference is there's one Catholic church, and it's run by your man in the Vatican, the German, and it's a top-down organisation. But there are hundreds of different denominations in the Protestant community, in the Protestant church. I mean, we would have Presbyterians, we would have Methodists, we would have Church of Ireland, we would have Baptist. I don't know, whatever else we had, all the evangelical groups. But then even within the Presbyterian church, you would have Free Presbyterians, and what our family were non-subscribing Presbyterians or Unitarians. And whereas the Free Presbyterians in Paisley's church were the sort of the evangelical wing, the hellfire and brimstone, they must be born again, otherwise you're doomed. And the church that I belonged to was the liberal end of it. And a friend of mine who is a minister in Belfast at the moment, a guy called Mervyn
Norman?
No, not Norman Hamilton. Mervyn Gibson used to say that the Protestant mindset was that if you went to church on a Sunday and you didn't like the sermon, you started your own church. And that actually happened. That's what Paisley did. And then he didn't like the Unionist Party because he thought they were a bit too liberal, so he formed the Democratic Unionist Party, who now, ironically, are in power, and the biggest party in Northern Ireland, and they're in power with Sinn Féin. So we're aware of Paisley coming on the scene as a sort of hellfire and brimstone preacher who obviously hated anything to do with the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope was the Antichrist, and he started to build up a bit of a following, but never really impacted in our life. And I remember at the time, in 1966, which was the 50th anniversary of the 1916 rebellion. And there were mutterings about the IRA were going to use this and launch another campaign.
Yeah, the Easter Rising.
The Easter Rising. Sorry, what did I say?
He said the rebellion.
Well,
I didn't think everyone would know that.
The Easter Rising. And there was this mysterious organisation called the IRA, and they were going to use that as an uprising and attack us. But really we didn't know much about the IRA at the time, and we didn't know much or anything at all about 1916 and the Rising, and that came and passed. But it all changed, I think, in the late 60s with the introduction of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. I don't know if you've heard of that. And that's when it all changed. That's when the wheels really come off it. And what happened was there was a lot of discrimination in Northern Ireland, and the unionist elite kept the working class population in their place through a system of what they call gerrymandering, and that involved moving electoral boundaries, even in areas where there was a Catholic nationalist majority. They moved the boundaries around so they would always return unionists. And on top of that, you only got a vote if you owned property. And if you own 2 properties, you got 2 votes. If you own 100 properties, you got 100 votes, something along the lines of that. So basically, the Civil Rights Association came along, and at the time, there were people, young students like yourselves, all full of idealism and going to change the world, inspired by what happened with the Civil Rights Movement in America and what had happened in France, and academics and liberals. And basically, what they campaigned for was one man, one vote, which was not unreasonable, but at the time we didn't quite see it that way. And they also campaigned on housing and the unfair allocation of housing. And one of the big incidents at the time was in the town of Dungannon in County Tyrone, where a 3-bedroom house had been allocated to a single Protestant woman, and a Catholic family who had applied for the same house didn't get it. So the Civil Rights Association came onto the scene. And what they were doing, we learned this in hindsight, but at the time it appeared as anything but. They were using the laws of the state and the apparatus of the state to challenge the state on issues of rights and equality. But we didn't see it that way. We saw it as a challenge on our identity, our Protestantism, our unionism, our history, our tradition, and our culture, and we turned against it. Have you ever heard, Bill's maybe told you this, about how we demonise each other? We call Catholics Fenians and Taigs, and they call us Huns and Oranges and Jaffas. And I remember once going to a football match, and there was this part of the crowd were chanting, and it was something like civil rights Fenian shite. You know, so the whole thing was basically seen as a challenge to the state, and we took a view that this was our country, this was our state, these were our institutions, and we had to resist it. And then it just got progressively worse. The People's Democracy march from Belfast to Derry was attacked by loyalists. Riots broke out between Protestants and Catholics, and basically we started to descend into what we called the Troubles. And it spread throughout Northern Ireland, and it got to the stage where the then police force, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, which are stretched, they couldn't handle it, and it was descending into basically civil war. The guns had started to come out. There weren't many guns around at the time. The IRA, if anything, was a very, very small, insignificant group. There would have been a few maybe idealists, young idealists, but by and large there were veterans of the previous IRA campaign in the 50s and 60s, Operation Harvest. And from my understanding, all they did was meet around in smoky pubs and reminisce about the old times. So they were caught in the hop as well, with no weapons, very few weapons. Any weapons they had were in Dublin, where the leadership of the IRA was. And at the time, the IRA, under the leadership of Cathal Goulding, had made the decision that they were going to change their whole approach. And instead of this military business of trying to take on the might of the British Army, they became rabid socialists, and they were going to agitate through housing associations and social issues, and their dream was to unite the Protestant and Catholic working class. So everybody was caught in the hop. Everybody was caught in the hop. We did not see this coming, and it escalated so quick. It just sparked, and it spread across the country, and then it got to the stage where they had to call in the British Army, and the British Army came in, and they sort of served initially as a buffer between the two communities, and they put up barbed wire and manned roadblocks and basically kept us from each other's throats. And at the time they came in, everybody welcomed them and gave them tea and biscuits. And
it's always chancy to replay history, but if reforms had been made, say in 1967, 68, do you think it might have forestalled the conflict?
Well, hindsight's a wonderful thing. The Prime Minister during part of that period was a guy called O'Neill, Terence O'Neill. And Captain O'Neill, he was landed gentry. I mean, there's no doubt about that, Eton and the Guards. But he was a bit of a reformist, and he was a bit of a liberal as well. And he did try and make moves at reform. And I remember at the time he brought up Sean Lemass, who was the then Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland. I remember the photograph. It was in the winter and there was snow on the ground. So he took him up to Stormont Castle and Paisley, and some of his cohorts were throwing snowballs at him, which is probably better than petrol bombs and bricks, but he probably didn't see the funny side of it. So yes, perhaps that might have happened, but O'Neill was ousted because he was too liberal. He was too liberal, and perhaps he was ahead of his time.
So as time went on, was it a foregone conclusion that it was going to go down, get worse, spiral downward? I mean, what were the triggering points? The British Army, first of all, was welcome. Then, of course, they became adversaries, and they sided with Protestants, with Ulster.
Well, yeah, I mean, when the British Army came in again, you know, like the RUC, like the political establishment, this was our army coming in, and it was actually welcomed at the time, pardon me, to the Catholic community, because the Protestants probably were getting the upper hand at the time in terms of the riots and the troubles. So they were welcomed into the Catholic areas, and there's photographs of them, old black and white grainy photographs of people coming out and giving them tea and biscuits, and it was all very jovial, and they chatted to them and brought them into their houses. And I can remember people at the time in the Short Strand area of Belfast, which is a Republican enclave surrounded largely by the rest of Protestant East Belfast. And I remember at the time a lady in the Short Strand actually had a soldier staying with her as a sort of a lodger, and that's how they were sort of welcomed in. But then that started to change gradually, and the IRA probably saw this as an opportunity that they couldn't resist. There was turmoil, and probably as they saw it, the time was right for another go at forcing United Ireland through armed struggle. And they started to escalate their campaign. They were supported by the Irish government in the early stages as well. They denied it at the time, but they did make money available to the IRA at the time to buy weapons. I actually know a chap, I know him quite well, he's a long-standing member of the IRA, and he could actually tell you where the bank account was, and to this day can still tell you the number of the bank account that they used to draw down the money to purchase the weapons. So it escalated, and you know, Newton's third law, I think it is, says to every force there's an equal and opposite force, an equal and opposite force, and that's exactly what happened. And I remember at the time, in Protestant areas, the IRA was sort of starting to get their act together. Young people flocked to join the IRA, so they went from being a very small, insignificant organisation to being quite a large organisation. And at one stage, I think there were so many recruits coming in, they found it difficult to cope. We saw this, of course, as a battle against us. They were fighting us. They wanted to take away our Britishness, our way of life, our traditions, our whole culture, our whole reason for being, and take us into this state 100 miles down the road, which we saw at the time as being a third world country and also being a priest-ridden state dominated by the Roman Catholic Church. That's probably a wee bit extreme, but nevertheless at that time the Catholic Church did have tremendous influence in the political affairs and the social affairs of the Republic of Ireland. They had a special part in the constitution of the country, and on controversial issues like contraception and abortion and mixed marriages, the Catholic Church basically flexed their muscles, and the government at the time bowed to their might. So we saw this as pushing us, trying to push us into this hell, basically, and so we had to resist it. And at the time, the UVF in the mid-60s had started to reform again as things started to ferment. And most areas had their own vigilantes. And so where I lived, we had vigilantes as well. And the vigilantes would basically come out at night and you patrolled the streets of your area and made sure that it wasn't going to be attacked. And we didn't have any weapons, but we used to carry big sticks. And then that sort of that graduated into paramilitarism. The vigilantes, which were all individual areas, I mean literally areas and sometimes streets had their own vigilantes, and then through a period of time the vigilantes came together and they became the Ulster Defence Association. And there were exciting times, and I mean I flirted with paramilitarism in the early days, and I joined up in a paramilitary group which is no longer in existence. I'll not mention their name, but and I did that for two reasons. I did it first of all because you felt our community was under threat, and I was honour bound and duty bound to defend my community and my people, and also a bit of excitement. It was good crack. You know, you got to wear combat jackets and masks and stop people in cars, and you know, you'd stop your next door neighbour at a roadblock and ask him what his name was and where he lived. And that did happen. It happened on a couple of occasions. But I soon dropped out. What happened at the time, the company I worked for sent me to work in London, and I ended up going to work in London, work in Belfast 1 week, maybe in London for 2 or 3 weeks after it. So I sort of broke my connections and that's probably what saved me getting into the clutches of paramilitarism. But some of my friends dropped out as well, and some of my relatives dropped out, but others stayed in, and some of them, you know, went up through the ranks of the paramilitary groups. And a very good friend of mine, Billy, who was one of my best pals, who died of a heart attack a couple of years ago, he ended up the local commander of the area. But it was exciting. It was exciting, you know. It broke the monotony, and you also had a bit of power and a feeling of belonging, and this feeling of power and camaraderie, and you know, staying out all night and lighting a fire and maybe having the odd beer or two, and stopping your neighbours and going about your business. And it was exciting. It brought a bit of excitement to what was otherwise a rather, you know, mundane and routine lifestyle.
Do you have any questions as we're going along?
Easy ones. I don't do hard questions.
Yeah. What justification did the paramilitary leaders, the UDA, for example, give to attract people, to recruit people, other than the fact that they're attacking us, our culture, our religion, you know, the republic in the south is going to take over? What other things?
That was it. I mean, basically, you know, defend your community. If you are a Protestant, if you're a loyalist, a unionist, if you hold and cherish our values, then the right thing to do is to defend those. And I mean, the Protestant community in Ireland, from the plantation, has always felt under siege. You know, everything to us was a conspiracy. Anything happened at all, it was a conspiracy to take us down the road to United Ireland, that priest-ridden third world banana republic down the road as we saw it then. And we were obsessed with this. Everything was a conspiracy. And just as we would say that the Catholic nationalist community, every opportunity they were victims. They wallowed in victimhood. And they were victims, and they were discriminated against. There's no doubt about that. They were discriminated in housing, against in jobs. But I didn't discriminate against them because I had no power. I mean, I was as poor as they were. The holes in my shoes were probably only marginally smaller than my Catholic neighbours and Catholic friends. It was the ruling elite. And it stood as the ruling elite, the old unionists, the old landed gentry who owned the mills and controlled things. And it suited them to keep the working class in their place, and it suited them to play the Protestants off against the Catholics. So we got the jobs, we got the, we were slightly better off than our neighbours. But, you know, at the time, the housing in places like the Shankill was equally as bad as the Falls. You know, what we used to call 2 up, 2 down houses, and an outside toilet. And the housing in the Shankill was every bit as bad as the Falls. But we somehow believed that we were probably better than them and better off than them, and we'd been fed this. And, you know, come elections, you would never see them apart from election time, because most of them lived in Mayfair and Chelsea and London anyway. They'd come over and blather the drums and bring out the bands and say, look, vote for us. You guys really aren't smart enough to run the country. Just leave it to us. Just elect us and we'll make all the decisions for you. Just leave it to us and we'll see that you're all right. So it suited the union, the elite, to keep the working class in their place. But a story probably, it's I think, and reading through Bill's book, he makes a statement in it there, but for the grace of God. And that actually applied, and that's very apt. And it happened to a friend of mine.
I haven't read that part yet, I don't think. Tell them what it means.
It's there, but for the grace of God. It's something we would use in Ireland. It could be me. If it hadn't been the grace of God, it could have been me in any sort of a circumstance. And I'm quoting this to impress Bill and let him know that I've read his book. Did just skim through it. There, but for the grace of God. And a friend of mine and two pals of his were walking up the Donegal Road one night, and one of the paramilitary groups they were drilling and recruiting in a park, and David and his 2 pals stopped, as you would do, just to see what was going on, and this guy was saying, come on, join up, sign up now, fight to defend Ulster. And David's 2 friends both went in and joined the organisation. Can't remember which organisation it was, but Colin didn't. David, whatever his name was. David didn't, and he turned and went back home. Now, the 2 that did go in and signed up, one of them was killed. One of them was actually killed in a feud. We do a lot of feuds back home. And the other one ended up spending quite a bit of time in prison. So David's life sort of pivoted. He ended up actually with a very good job in the media and a nice, comfortable lifestyle, thank you very much. But he always says when we're sitting having a pint, you know what, his life that split-second decision determined the rest of his life. If he had turned right, instead of walking home, if he had turned right and walked into the clutches of that paramilitary group, God only knows. Thereabout for the grace of God. Go I.
How about the Orange Order? What role did they play in all of this, especially during the early period?
The Orange Order at one stage was a very, very powerful organisation, and it was basically aligned with the Unionist Party. I think I can remember as a kid on the 12th of July when they paraded, there might have been 100,000 people out parading and 2 or 3 or 4 times as many people watching them. Now I think they're falling into decline quite a bit. They'll be stronger in rural areas than they would be in urban areas. But the Orange Order came about again as a sort of a defence mechanism, what was known as the Battle of the Diamond way back in history. And it was basically it was a religious and fraternal organisation that was established to protect and promote Protestant values and the Protestant ethos, and also again as a mechanism against the United Ireland. And it's 100% staunchly Protestant-based and Reformation-based. The Orange Order, I would think and have to say, is that, and every village had them. Every village had an Orange Hall. In those days, when I was a kid growing up, we had one as well. And in many communities, the Orange Order and the Orange Hall itself, the premises, was sort of the glue that kept the community together. So they would have dances in the Orange Hall. They would have whist drives, and people would have parties and things like that. There was never any drink taken because most of them were very anti-drinkers. So alcohol. And they would actually have what they called, some of them would be temperance lodges, where their members, a bit like the pioneers in the Catholic Church, vow not to touch alcohol. But that's on the face of it. Most of them, like ourselves, enjoy a few drinks. But the Orange Order was probably used by, again, the Unionist elite as a way of keeping the Protestant working class in line. It would be mainly, not exclusively, but mainly a working class organisation. What you find today has gone back, pardon me, and to a lesser extent now, that it was connected very, very closely to the Ulster Unionist Party. So most members of the Ulster Unionist Party were members of the Orange Order. A lot of the ruling elite would actually have been members of the Orange Order as well, but they wouldn't have paraded with the peasants, the working class. They wouldn't be seen to lower themselves to go out on the 12th of July and parade with the rest of them. But they were members, and it was a great mechanism for control, because with so many members, that 100,000 people at one stage, that was a big block. It's more or less in decline now. It's still. They formally broke their links with the Unionist Party, I think, about 10 years ago. The likes of David Trimble, when he was First Minister, he was a member of the Orange Order. The likes of Red Gyamfi, who was leader of the Unionist Party up until quite recently, would be a member. But some of the more liberal members of the Unionist Party now, the likes of a guy called Basil McRae, I don't know if you ever came across him, is not a member of the Orange Order. He's a Unionist, an official Unionist MLA. So you find that maybe some of the younger ones and the more liberal members of the Unionist Party now would not be members of the Orange Order. Still an important, still a big player, I suppose. And they would be the ones probably, the most controversy we have at the moment would be because of Orange Order parades, with the contested parades in areas mainly like where we are in the Lower Shankill in North Belfast, past the Ardoyne Flats. They still insist on walking what they would call their traditional routes. And the residents oppose these marches, and they come out and protest about not being consulted.
Why would Orangemen want to march through a Catholic neighbourhood? Why would they insist upon marching through? Because they're not welcome?
Well, I think you'd really have to ask an Orangeman that, and I've asked the question myself. I think it goes deeper. The Orange Order would talk about their traditional routes, the roads that they walked traditionally, and the geography has changed quite a bit in Northern Ireland. So, for example, in areas in Portadown where maybe 40, 50 years ago, I'm not quite sure, they would have walked through areas that were predominantly Protestant, and because of population shifts, those areas now would be, largely Catholic and largely nationalist. So there's been this whole demographic shift which has changed the ballgame, and they see it as their right to walk the Queen's Highway. And I think it's still a matter of asserting their Britishness, and they would see it as not giving in to the unreasonable demands of republicanism. And they would say, why do Republicans actually have a problem with us displaying our culture and displaying our heritage? And I think actually, a lot of people in the Republican communities would travel quite a distance to be offended. They bus loads. Some of them, they bring them in by bus loads to support the protests. So people go out of their way to be offended. They would argue, and it's a question of, I think, competing rights. They do have a right to walk the Queen's Highway, just as the residents groups have a right, to a peaceful existence. And some of the residents groups would argue that when the parades are going past, the security is so tight that they're hemmed into their houses and they can't leave their houses. So both sides, I think, in many ways, have actually painted themselves into a corner over it. And they meet and they discuss items, and they try and come to some sort of an accommodation where perhaps contentious flags won't be carried, and party songs, the bands won't play party songs as they walk past, say, Catholic chapels, Catholic churches, or these areas. And they try and negotiate to soften it down. But basically, I think it's the unstoppable force meets the immovable object. And there really doesn't seem to be any great solution. Sorry?
I have a quick question. A few moments ago, you said something that really resonated with me, and it was about that the hole in our shoes were just a little bit larger than the hole in the Catholic shoes. And that really says something. And you also speak to the fact that the ruling elite, the political elite, his job was, or intent was to keep the working class in its place. And we're talking two working classes. We're talking the Protestant working class. We're also talking the Catholic working class. And during the times, the troubles that we've been speaking of for those 30 years, was there ever any sort of community activism that took place within the Shankill Road community and the Protestant communities that understood the fact that even though their holes were just a little bit smaller than the Catholics, they were also experiencing repression and can you speak to that? Was any of that going on, or was that not even a consideration?
It did go on. It did go on. For example, I mentioned that most of the heavy industries were populated by Protestant workers, and like my father, most of them, or certainly a very high percentage of them, would have been trade unionists. So they would have been in more to equality and class issues. And in fact, I remember actually as a child, my father taking me into Belfast one day and take me down East Belfast and Woodstock Road, and he showed me this cul-de-sac, and this cul-de-sac was known as Red Square because everybody who lived in it were all members of the Irish Communist Party. So they weren't just trade unionists. Some of them were actually, in fact, in those days, most of the Communist Party in Ireland actually came from the Protestant community, because Catholic Church detested communists, So there would have been that. There was at that stage the Northern Ireland Labour Party, and they would have campaigned for rights and for equality, and they would have campaigned on class issues. And I don't know if my father was actually a member of it, but I know certainly he was a supporter of it. And at one stage they did have, I think, about 2 or 3 MPs. But like a lot of things, it imploded, and I think whereas when the Northern Ireland Labour Party obviously tried very, very hard not to be sectarian, but I think eventually the rifts appeared in it which were to do with religion and sectarianism, and eventually the Northern Ireland Labour Party it just disbanded. There's a chap I know in Belfast called Erskine Holmes, I come across every now and again. And from memory, Erskine was the last chairman of the old Northern Ireland Labour Party. And I remember giving him a lift up. We were down in Dublin one night with a minibus load of people down at a function in Dublin. I think it was a debate actually about the poppy and the lily. That's what I remember it was. And Erskine had taken the
Tell us what the poppy and the lily means.
Well, the poppy is worn in remembrance of people who died in the First and Second, largely in the First and Second World Wars. It's a little red poppy, and it's based on the poppies that grew in the fields of Flanders, where the First World War particularly was fought. And we would wear those on the 11th of November, which is Remembrance Sunday. The opposite of that really would be the Easter lily, which Republicans would wear on Easter Sunday in their parades commemorating the 1916 rebellion. Symbols, they're basically divisive symbols. Although it's quite complicated, but up until quite recently, the Somme and the sacrifice at the Somme in 1916 would have been very much to preserve of the Protestant Unionist population. But Catholics and Nationalists fought in the same battle, not in the 36th Ulster Division, they fought in the 16th Irish Division. So both religions and both political ideologies fought against fascism in the First War, albeit for different reasons. The Unionists fought on the basis that they believed that it would strengthen the union with Britain, and the Catholic Nationalists fought basically, on one hand, to defend what they saw as small Catholic nations like Belgium, but also they were led to believe through their leaders at the time, Redmond and so forth, that by doing this it would strengthen the cause or the case for the Home Rule. So that's why we wear poppies, and why Republicans coming up at Easter would wear the lilies, and Easter Sunday's
coming up
next Sunday.
Yeah.
No doubt they'll be out with their Easter lilies. So we've been down at this talk about this debate, does the Easter lily and the poppy have equal meaning and equal value, and could they coexist? Anyway, the story was that we gave Erskine a lift back to Belfast with us, and I got talking to him, and I said, is there no chance of the old Northern Ireland Labour Party being resurrected in some form or fashion? And he said, no, not really. It's time had gone. Now, my politics would be Labour, you know, and when I vote, and I always vote, I always push people and tell people that the only way to change things is to vote. But because I don't have any real empathy for any of the parties in Northern Ireland, I vote from the bottom up. You know, I vote for the ones that I most want to keep out, and then work my way up to the ones that are least objectionable. Not the best way to do it. I think one of the problems we have in Northern Ireland is that, and this is a bit of an irony, is that, you know, we fight to be British, and we've fought to be British, and we are determined to be British. But up until quite recently, we had no influence in British politics. Neither the Conservative Party nor the Labour Party organised in Northern Ireland. The Conservative Party do now. They had an alliance with the Unionist Party the last elections, which turned out to be a bit of a disaster for both of them. So they've now gone their separate ways, and both have candidates up in the May 5th elections. The Labour Party never organised in Northern Ireland, the British Labour Party. And if anybody from Northern Ireland applied to join the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, they were referred to our SDLP. Have you ever heard of the Social Democratic and Labour Party in Northern Ireland? They're a nationalist party. So someone like myself who would want to join the Labour Party, for example, wouldn't have any great desire whatsoever to join the SDLP. A trade unionist, I can't remember his name, challenged this, and actually I think took it to the European Court of Human Rights, because this was discrimination. We were disenfranchised. We had no right or no way of voting for the government that ruled us, and it didn't get to the Human Rights Commission. The Labour Party gave in and said, right, you can now join the British Labour Party, but you can and you can't, if you know what I mean. It's not encouraged.
You're talking about political parties and Labour. To what extent would you say that social class may be more important than religious tradition in Northern Ireland?
I think it's changing. I know certainly from my own perspective and my own journey, it's changed. When the Troubles broke out, we really never gave a great deal of thought to class. We saw ourselves probably as a bit better off than the Catholics, and our Britishness, if you like, was probably more important to us than our class. But recently, in recent years, I think the Protestant working class in particular are starting to become more aware of class. There's an old saying, an old adage, that in years gone by, if a unionist had got a goat and put a Union Jack on it, people would have voted for it. It wasn't quite that bad. I don't know about, maybe a donkey, I don't know about a goat. We might have voted for, in fact, we have voted for a few donkeys in our time. A few of them still running around there. So class never really became a big issue because we were caught up, our focus and our attention was on this war that we were fighting in different fronts. But increasingly, the Protestant working class are unhappy, and they feel, in all the research we have done, feel very disconnected to their political representatives. They feel that their political representatives, the unionist political representatives that is, are not representing their interests. And they feel totally disconnected and totally out of the loop when it comes to politics. They would claim, and I think with some justification in working class areas, that the only time you ever see our politicians is when they want your vote. And then they're over you like a bad rash, you know. And then once they get their vote, they disappear off again. Where I am in the Lower Shankill, most of our politicians, apart from a couple of councillors, most of them don't live in the area. You know, they live in nice, comfortable middle-class areas, thank you very much. Whereas if you go into the Republican West Belfast, you'll find that most of their West Belfast political representatives actually live in the area. They used to have this great habit in Protestant areas of what we would call parachuting them in. You would parachute someone in from the country areas, and they would beat the big drum and play the orange card, and we would vote them and they would get elected, and they wouldn't have a clue what the issues were in the area. So I've found increasingly the working class people are saying this is not good enough, and I keep telling them that, not myself, many other people, that the politicians work for us, not the other way around. We're their masters, and through the ballot box we have the power either to elect them or to get rid of them. And it's just trying to get people to understand that they do have that power. They do have that power, and I think they're becoming much more aware of class politics now than they had been when the Troubles were at their height. Easy question.
I was just wondering, when you were talking about the Troubles and when you were talking about ideology, you kept saying like we and fighting for our Britishness, and I'm just curious personally, how much does that resonate with you personally? Like, how British do you feel? And when you were beginning your little involvement with paramilitarism, how much was that really a personal, like, anti-Catholic feeling or pro-British feeling for you, and how has that, if that has evolved over the course of time?
Good question.
I said easy questions.
I warned you.
You weren't paying attention, were you? I have to say, in my own, I was never overly obsessed with religion. Religion really didn't mean a great deal to me. But your environment, where you're brought up, your family, your community, that determines your values and your political outlook. I mean, if I had been born 200 yards across the road in Republican West Belfast, would I have been fighting for my Britishness? No, it wouldn't have been. I would have been fighting for my Irishness and the United Ireland. So it's nature and nurture. But it's in those days it was very important to me, because we tend to be a very stubborn race, you know, and if somebody tries to take something away from you or thrust something upon you, then you fight against it. Have you ever heard Brendan Behan, the Irish writer? Long since dead. Brendan Behan, if you ever look it up, he wrote a couple of books called The Hostage and The Queer Fellow. And he was a member of the IRA himself and was imprisoned in England for trying to plant bombs over there in the 50s. But Brendan Behan once said that the Irish don't know what they want, but they'll fight anybody to get it. And he's possibly not wrong. But what happened in the 60s and what happened, in 1916 with the Easter Rising, in 1798 with the United Irishmen, in 1690 when King William of Orange defeated King James at the Battle of the Boyne and the Glorious Revolution. I mean, the world has moved on, from those days. The world's a smaller place. Ireland is no longer, inhabited by leprechauns. We don't live in thatched cottages and keep pigs in the front room any longer. We've got electricity and running water and all now. I mean, it's wonderful with things called television and telephones. The world has moved on dramatically. We're all Europeans now. We're all members of the European Union. Whether we like it or not and what our views are on the European Union, we are Europeans. We're a small, very, very small island on the periphery of Europe. There's 1.5 million people in Northern Ireland. We really punch above our weight. For all the numbers of us, we can cause pretty much chaos everywhere we go. The whole of Ireland is 6 million people, which would probably fit into the state of Oregon. Who's a mathematician? 3, 4, 5 times, Bill? We're a tiny, tiny country, and sometimes I think we take ourselves too seriously. But the world has moved on. We're part of the European Union. Increasingly, Europe, Brussels, is becoming stronger, and the sovereign powers of the nations that make up the EU are being eroded. And Europe's getting bigger. I mean, at the moment, apparently, they're working on one single constitution for the European Union. They're talking about one EU army. So all the power is going, and get to the stage where our politicians will be responsible for emptying your bins and making sure the lights work. And then with globalization, globalization's made the world a much, much smaller place. That's why I can come here today and talk to you. I could 50 years ago, 100 years, it would take me 6 months in the boat and whatever. So the world is a much smaller place. The world has changed dramatically. Ireland has changed dramatically. Dublin is a cosmopolitan European city now. You stand on O'Connell Street in Dublin, and it's a bit like standing in Broadway in New York when you hear all the different languages. They actually reckon by 2020, something like 50% of the population of Ireland could be non-Irish. They could be immigrants of maybe first and second generation immigrants. The fastest growing religion in the south of Ireland at the moment is Islam. The second fastest growing religion is Orthodox Catholicism. The power of the Roman Catholic Church is diminished. Young people, and my son and his wife live in Dublin. I'll be up and down to Dublin also. The days of being terrified of priests have gone. The attendance at mass has dropped dramatically. So the world has changed dramatically, and I think what we need to do is rethink our politics, because Ireland, and it's the Ireland of the quiet man and John Wayne and of Darby O'Gill and the little people. That's not Ireland, And then also, if you look at the British Empire's gone. The Scots have their own parliament, the Welsh have their own parliament. We have our own assembly, parliament of sorts. They're not very good at it and haven't quite, I think, got the hang of real politics yet. But they're getting there. They will get there. Even the people in Cornwall want their own parliament. So the whole concept of British and the United Kingdom and the Empire, that's all going as well. And somewhere out there, I think we need some fresh thinking. Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, is on the verge of bankruptcy. It's been bailed out by the International Monetary Fund and the European Union. So, to all extents and purposes, the Republic of Ireland is no longer a sovereign state. It's owned and run by the bead counters in the International Monetary Fund. So the world has changed, and if we all went, oh, we've had enough, right, lads, we give up. We've beaten us, United Ireland tomorrow. They would put the Irish army up along the border and to keep us out. The last thing they want is another million people to. That's it. Especially 1.5 million people, and especially 1 million mad Protestants. It's the last thing they want, come down there disrupting things. So I think we need some new thinking, and we need to rethink the whole concept of United Ireland and the whole concept of Britishness against the backdrop of a changing world. And unless we do that, the troubles will never start again. We have the dissidents at the moment, but And the Troubles in Northern Ireland have come in cycles, 10, 15, 20 year cycles. This one's been the longest one and the bloodiest one for all sorts of reasons. But prior to that, they had Operation Harvest in the 50s and the 60s. And we've broken that cycle. We'll never go back to that conflict that we had over the last 35 years.
This question. We have just a few minutes left, but we'll take a question.
Do you think that the new interest in class in Protestant working class neighborhoods will bring them closer to the Catholic working class? Do you think any of them will vote for Sinn Féin on the 5th?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
That is a very good question. You weren't paying attention either when I said about easy questions. I don't know if they would go as far in any significant numbers. No, they'll not vote for Sinn Féin. They'll not vote for Sinn Féin. But having said that, when Gerry Adams retained the seat the last time in West Belfast, he claimed that people from the Lower Shankill had voted for him. And people I know laughed at that. That didn't happen. I actually think there are a few people out there who did. Not in any great numbers, but the fact that a few of them did is actually quite significant. From time to time, we would have people calling into our office. We have people calling into our office all the time, day and daily. But we have had people come into our office and tell us openly that they have been in touch with Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin's office in the Lower Falls, which is probably no more than a couple hundred yards. Yeah. I was going to say it's within a stone's throw, but we don't do that anymore. A good catapult, you could reach it probably. And the reason they've contacted Sinn Féin is they've had problems with housing, benefits, whatever the problem has been, and they've maybe gone to their unionist representatives and haven't been helped. And if your roof's leaking and the water's pouring in, your first priority is to get somebody who can sort it out, regardless of what hue they are and what colour. And they've come in and they've said, yeah, we've contacted Sinn Féin, and they've helped us. And now, of course, Sinn Féin will bust their gut to help. If they get a call from the Shankill Road, this is a brilliant opportunity for them, and they'll bust a gut. So I have no doubt that some people, pretty small numbers at the moment, have voted for Sinn Féin. Will the bulk of them vote for them? No, I don't think so. The vast majority will not vote for them. Is there room for another party? Well, I don't know. We have the Progressive Unionist Party, which was and probably still is aligned to the UVF in certain ways. When they came out, I thought they were a breath of fresh air. Have you touched upon the likes of David Irvine, the late David Irvine? Well, have a look at the late David Irvine. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago. He had a heart attack. He died quite young, in his 50s. But David Irvine was an ex-prisoner, UVF prisoner, and he came out and he came onto the political stage, and he was like a breath of fresh air. You've met him.
He was indeed. Yeah,
breath of fresh air, articulate, honest. Now, there's something in a politician, an honest politician. Basically talked about his background, about his journey, and about his change in his beliefs and his values. And they launched the Progressive Unionist Party, the PUP, and they come up with this what they called a new concept of progressive unionism. So it wasn't this old unionism where everybody said no, and that's all we ever did. We said no, not an inch, no surrender, never. Was my Ian Paisley impression. Everything was no. We didn't even know the question we were throwing at no, and the answer is no. Now, what's the question? And they come out, and he was like, he and there was a couple of others like Billy Hutchison, and they were like a breath of fresh air, and they were a pro-union party, but overtly working class and verging on socialism. In fact, probably most of them were socialists.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah. And I remember watching David Irvine on television. For the first time, I felt inspired. I really thought, this is it. This is a whole new concept. This is new thinking. And it just didn't happen. It didn't happen. For some reason, they come off, and they started off with a bang. And a lady called Dawn Purvis, who's a very, very able politician. She left the DUP. She ended up the leader of the DUP when David Irvine died. And then she left, I think, because of their links with the UVF. And there was a murder about a year and a bit ago of a guy on the Shankill Road. And that caused a lot of disruption in the PUP. But they were the Great White Hope. And it didn't happen for them. It just didn't happen for whatever reason. And a few people have said that there is a difference. I don't know if this is true or not, but in the Protestant mindset and the Catholic mindset is that the Catholics will vote for ex-prisoners, you know, and there are a lot. The Deputy First Minister, I think he did a short time in the Republic, but a lot of our ministers, like Jerry Kelly and so forth, and Conor Murphy, they've been IRA prisoners and they get elected. For some reason, the Protestant working class, certainly not the Protestant middle class wouldn't do it, will not vote for ex-terrorists, as they say it. I don't know why. A friend of mine had an interesting take on it. He said it's to do with confession, that in the Catholic Church you go, and as he calls it, you get your pot scraped. You ever heard that? It quite appeals to me, this idea of being out and, you know, indulging in a lot of sin and vice all week and going to the confessional for a couple of minutes and Sunday in the States wipe clean. It quite appeals to me. And maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's what it is, that the Protestant mindset is different. You know, it's you don't give forgiven just quite so easily.
Has the siege mentality hindered economic development in Northern Ireland?
Oh yeah, big time. Who would invest in Northern Ireland when we're murdering each other? I mean, it's the first thing. There's a lot of the working class in Northern Ireland, you probably know, live in their own areas, amongst their own kind. The Lower Shankill, as I say, is 94, 95, 96% Protestant. So we live this segregated life, and there's a campaign on at the moment. It started about a policy document come out called the Shared Future, and basically it was the government's vision of how we would live together and share resources, and it was driven by financial considerations, and it was also driven by, I suppose, living in a normal society, normalisation. The financial end of it means that, and a prime example of it is the Lower Shankill and the Lower Falls. The Shankill Road has a leisure centre. The Falls Road, I think, has a leisure centre and a swimming pool. We have a library. They have a library. Realistically, one leisure centre would do both communities, service both communities. One library would service both communities. So twice the resources have to be spent because of segregation. And if we lived in a shared society, then we could share the leisure centre and we could share the library, and that would free up money that could be put into education and health and roads or development or whatever. Also, in attracting inward investment, you know, investors don't like risk, and you know, certainly during the Troubles it was very difficult. And the government bent over backwards with all sorts of incentives to bring largely American investors into Northern Ireland, the likes of Learfan and Learjet, and there were a few others. DeLorean was the most infamous, John DeLorean. When every other country in Europe had turned him down, everybody else seemed to know that he had been involved in a few dodgy dealings. Our geniuses threw money at him and brought him in and give him this fabulous factory and literally threw money at him. I mean, a friend of mine worked for him, not for him directly, but for DeLorean. And they sent him over to California for 2 weeks, and he didn't know why. And when they arrived over at the plant in California, nobody had any idea it was coming. So they gave him a car and a few bob expenses and told him to go enjoy himself for a couple of weeks and fly back to Belfast after it. I mean, they threw money around, and then of course DeLorean get up to all sorts of dodgy deals and left. Learfan did the same. And a lot of these countries that come in and they brought investment for a very short period of time. There was nothing sustainable about it whatsoever. And they employed people, and they soaked up and used up all the incentives and all the money, the funding that was given to them to come in. And when that dried up, they closed the doors, waved us goodbye and get back in the jets to America and places like America. You guys have a lot to answer for. So, and then, I mean, nowadays this part of, a shared future for some reason, never really got off the ground, apart from being a policy document at Stormont. And it's now been sort of reworked, and it's called CSI, which is not crime scene investigation, in case anybody asks. It's cohesion, sharing and integration. But it's the same thrust, although it's had a lot of criticism because there isn't a great deal of meat on it. It's all aspirational. but there isn't a great deal of meat of how we're actually going to do these things. But yes, the answer is yes. I think there are great opportunities. You know, America, and I was winding you up about America because America has been one of the big investors. And I'll say that again, America have been one of the big investors in putting money into Northern Ireland when peace broke out, as part of the likes of the International Fund for Ireland. And I think if we do work our way through the problems that we have at the moment, and we resolve them, and we do become a more normal society, whatever a normal society is, I don't know, I've never been in one, then I think there would be a lot of goodwill out there, and I think we would be able to attract a lot of inward investment, and we need it desperately, because when people have jobs, they have a stake. You know, it's when people have no jobs and have no future and have no vision and have no aspirations and have no dreams that they become dangerous. But if you give someone a job, and we've seen this happen in areas, and suddenly they get back their self-esteem. You know, they have a few bob in their pockets, they can take their kids out. The next thing they buy a car, and they're able to get out and take their families out and about. And that works towards normalisation as well. So we need a lot of inward investment, but we've still work to do, I think.
We're going to take a short break right now for a few minutes, and when we come back, we'll start off talking about the police, which we haven't mentioned yet at all. And then we'll talk about some of the tensions that might be overcome by new proposals and things that might bring some reform in Belfast. So a few minutes break, and we'll come back in a few moments.
Go and grab a cigarette.
In this second segment, we'd first of all like to start off talking about the police and the role of security and even possible collusion between the police and the Loyalists in Northern Ireland, and then turn to the topics of what kinds of changes and reforms might be made. So let's start off talking about the police. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, now called the PSNI, the Police of Northern Ireland. What would you say about the police? And this, of course, is our second segment interview with Brian Watson. Brian?
Well, I mean, growing up and during the Troubles, they were our police force, if you know what I mean. They were there to protect us, and the state has a duty to protect its citizens. So we would have supported the police, and we would have supported them in their efforts to suppress the IRA. This was our police force, much in the way as we saw the politicians as our politicians and the statutory bodies and institutions as ours. Then the relationships did change with the Protestant working class, because it was all very well when the police and the special branch were interning Catholics, but when they started to intern Protestants, you know, that wasn't in the script. We weren't really prepared for that, so there was suspicion then in a lot of the sort of Protestant working class areas against the police, and a realisation that actually they were there in the middle. They weren't really there to show the Protestant community any special favours. And they had a hard time of it, there's no doubt. You know, they lost a lot of men and a lot of women during the Troubles. A lot of them were killed, blown up, shot in front of their families. Policemen I knew, they earned good money, they earned, you know, good wages, and they earned overtime, but they lived their entire life on the edge, you know, checking under their cars every day that there were no under-vehicle booby traps, being suspicious of strangers coming to the door, telling their kids that at school to tell the teachers and their friends that their dads are civil servants, never to mention that they're police officers. So they did get a really hard time, but they were a product of their times. I remember once being in New York and talking to an American policeman one night in the bar. So I happen to frequent bars quite a lot, and I mean he told me about as a policeman, one policeman to another, about his admiration for the RUC. And I remember my ex-brother-in-law, who was a policeman, recently retired. And I remember he went to New York on holiday once with his family, and he happened to call into a police station just to pick up a few mementos of the NYPD. And when they heard that he was from the Royal Ulster Constabulary, he was treated like royalty. You know, they wined him and dined him and gave him all sorts of mementos back home. So from a policing point of view, they were admired and were probably good at what they did at the time. And then obviously as part of the whole process, the Patton Report looked at the whole police force, and they changed, and they went from being a constabulary to being a service. And I think gradually what they did was they pensioned off all of the old members of the RUC, and there aren't many of them left. Most of them are now pensioned off, and I have friends who are ex-RUC, and some of them will be actually quite younger than I am, and they've been pensioned off, and some of them actually feel quite bitter that they gave all this service over 25 years. They were in the front line, they took heavy casualties, and some of them feel genuinely that they were treated very badly at the end. But that's politics for you. What at the time the RUC, it was described as a Protestant force for a Protestant people, and probably 90% of the RUC were actually from the Protestant community. That's not actually to say that they discriminated per se, but Catholics, the Republican groups, deliberately, and the dissidents are doing it at the moment, would almost make a point of targeting, if they could, Catholic members of the RUC. And the dissident, as I said, the dissidents are doing that at the moment. The 2 police officers that they have killed are not only Catholics, but they were nationalists. They were Irish speakers. They played Gaelic football, which is, you may know as a very heavily identified with the nationalist cause. So most Catholics stayed well out of the RUC, because obviously if you live in the Falls Road, it wouldn't be a very healthy career option to be in the RUC. Patton came along and he went about addressing, first of all, changing the whole raison d'etre of the RUC away from a constabulary to a service, a police service. That involved changing the whole ethos and the whole mindset. And then he brought in this 50-50 recruitment, which was resisted by quite a number of, in fact, I would say most of the unionist politicians and probably most of the unionist population, because it's basically reverse discrimination. I think you call it positive discrimination over here. I can never get my head around this.
Affirmative action.
Positive discrimination. I mean, it's a contradiction in terms. And basically what it did do was it did discriminate and turn against Protestants. Because of this, it's changed now. I think they've finished, the Patton report is now just recently quite finished. But what it did, it meant that young, say, Protestants who had applied to join the police service and who had passed their medicals and passed all their tests and everything, were told at the end of it, well, yes, you passed everything, but we can't really give you a position because we need to get a couple of Catholics in to balance the workforce out. But nevertheless, it went ahead. It's finished now, and the police force, I'm not quite sure of how it's constituted at the moment, but I would imagine it's maybe around 65-35, 70-30, something like this. And it's good to see that young Catholics who are nationalists and are actually proud of being nationalists now feel that they want to join the PSNI. And I say, the sad thing about it is the dissidents seem to be targeting young Catholics. Catholic police officers. Pater Heffernan was blown up. He was the first one, and he lost his legs. He lost both legs. I didn't know him, obviously, but he was captain of the police Gaelic team. He was a fluent Irish speaker. The most recent one was the young chap Kerr down in Oma, and he was blown up and killed. And there was a tremendous support, and from the strangest places, in support of Constable Kerr and his family. For example, at his funeral, there was a guard of honour which comprised both members of the PSNI and the GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Association. And probably the most surprising one of all was the First Minister, Peter Robinson, who is a devout, born-again Christian, attended the funeral mass. And that was a massive step to take. He attended along with, I think, Martin McGuinness. And he got stick from his own people because of their views on the Catholic Church. And I mean, the Orange Order, one of the big sins in the Orange Order is attending a Catholic service, and you get expelled for that. Peter Robinson, I don't think, is an Orangeman. In fact, I'm pretty sure he's not. But for him to take that was a very, very bold move, and it sent out a signal to the community that, you know, Martin McGuinness and Peter Robinson, the GAA, the PSNI, and the community as a whole abhorred this terrible act. So the police service that we have today it's a different animal entirely, and they're into community policing. And in places like the Lower Shankill, where in the past there wouldn't have been a great deal of love for the RUC for various reasons, now we would work with them, we would work with the community policemen, and they would be in our office probably once a week. And we have set up courses which have been very successful. We called them Connect, and basically it's where we took people over a period of 6 weeks. We took people from our community to meet with police constables, and they told us about how they policed and what their responsibilities were, and we gave the community's viewpoint on how we felt that they should police communities, because community policing is a totally different animal from the old constabulary way. You know, in the past we would have said they were very heavy-handed, that when there was trouble at the interfaces or riots or whatever, their actions could have inflamed the situations. You know, they come down, they're known as ninjas, you know, because they would come down with the heavy black suits and the helmets and the shields and the batons, and you maybe have 50 kids, you know, 15, 16 or 17, causing trouble in the riot, causing riots in the interface. And it was heavy-handed. That sort of reaction and response to it was heavy-handed. Now we would work with the police quite a lot. As I said, we'd be in and out of our office quite often. They would come in and we would talk about crime, we would talk about antisocial behaviour, we would talk about incidents, the interfaces, and we would try and work together to the point where basically if we can help them and if we can give names of people who are causing trouble at the interfaces or are involved in antisocial behaviour, we pass it on to the RUC, to the PSNI. Likewise, when people come in to see us from the community and they're having problems with their neighbours or trouble with their neighbours, or antisocial behaviour or vandalism or whatever, we would refer them to go to the police and get the PSNI down to help them. Now, there are occasions, obviously, the big problem is all you ever hear is resources, resources, resources. Mm-hmm. They don't have the resources. And, you know, every time one neighbour has a wild party, you know, that sort of thing would be a low priority to the PSNI. It's not a low priority to the people who live next door to them. Mind you, here up at 5 o'clock in the morning, you know, listening to this bump, bump, bump type music. In situations like that, we would go to doors and we would tell people, no, this sort of behaviour is not acceptable. You have to have more respect for the needs and the wishes of your neighbours and knock it in the head. And if they don't stop it, then we would try and get the PSNI involved in it, or the council. So the whole policing environment has changed, and the whole community involvement. And the big thing probably, Bill, for example, is this is also true in the Republican communities as well. They work with the PSNI now. Mm. And what you see now is you see policemen walking the beat on the Falls Road and doing what community policemen are meant to do. You wouldn't have seen that in the Troubles. I mean, you just wouldn't have happened.
Before we turn to proposed reforms, could you touch on the collusion thing? Because a lot of nationalists contended that during the conflict there was collusion between the police and loyalists.
And possibly
allegations
and between the police and Republicans as well.
Yeah.
A friend of mine says collusion was an illusion, that if they really were, a friend of mine who was involved in paramilitarism at the sharp end, that if there really was this level of collusion, they probably would have done a lot more damage. You know, he would have walked out his door with an AK-47 over his shoulder without worrying too much about being arrested for it. It would seem now, yes, that there was collusion. There's no point in denying it. The police, the special branch, ran informers, and they ran informers both in the Loyalist paramilitary groups and in the Republican groups. Freddie Scappaticci, Steak Knife, I don't know if you've ever heard of him in your study, but he was probably the biggest one. He was in charge of the IRA's internal security unit, affectionately known as the Nutting Squad. And their job basically was to deal with informers, to dig out and uncover informers within the ranks of the Republican movement, and basically to execute them.
And he was the highest informer of
and
all.
It turned out he was a very high-ranking informer. There was one called Dennis Donaldson, who was a high-ranking officer in Sinn Féin, ex-IRA prisoner, big friend of Bobby Sands. Sands was in jail with Bobby Sands. He was head of Sinn Féin's administration at Stormont, and he was unmasked a few years ago as a spy of 20 years standing. And he was sort of expelled from Sinn Féin, ended up living in a wee cottage in Donegal, which literally didn't have electricity or water. He managed to find one of the few that were still left, and he was killed. He was killed by Republicans, and ironically enough, only in the last couple of weeks, two people have been arrested. I don't think they've been charged, but they've certainly been questioned about that. So there was probably collusion. There were certainly informers, but again, maybe going back to what I said at the start, and this term, the Troubles, not doing justice to what was going on. It was a war. It was a bloody war. Wars aren't nice. They wouldn't be called wars if they were nice. They're nasty, and the different factions, I suppose, do what they have to do, and they have, to win, or to win advantage. And all governments run spies. All governments run touts. It's part of intelligence, and it's part of counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism, and that's the way they did it. And the British are good at it. I mean, they've been at this for hundreds of years. We're only playing at it. They've been at it for a long, long time. They're masters of it.
The question has come up what you do, and maybe you could give us some background in terms of what you're doing every day, and then we'll open the floor for questions.
Yeah, okay. I work for an organisation, as Bill said, called BCRC, Belfast Conflict Resolution Consortium, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's an organisation that is made up of activists who work in the interface areas in Belfast, north, south, east and west Belfast, both loyalist and Republican, set up initially about 4 years ago. And so there are 3 of us, I think, from, if you like, the Protestant community, and 5 from the Republican community, and we work together. The thrust of our work really is peace building and reconciliation, but that would be underpinned with a sort of a community development ethos. So we believe that a lot of the work that needs to be done in interface communities involves sensible and planned regeneration. And as I said earlier, this is about building up the confidence and giving people visions and giving people a stake, that who live in these deprived interface areas. We would be involved in a lot of projects that would be aligned to community education, development. We're running quite a lot at the moment on a programme on emerging leaders, and this is a bit of a problem that we all have, that most of the activists at the moment are not getting any, well, none of us are getting any younger, but some of us are sort of stretching it a wee bit, and we're getting a bit older. And succession, a big issue now would be getting young people coming behind us who have the skills and the experience basically to take up the baton and continue what we were doing. So one of the programs that we run at the moment is called Emerging Leaders, where I've brought, I think it's 12 or 16 young people from the 4 areas of Belfast, both unionist and nationalist, and we have a programme together, put together, where they will be trained over a period of time on all the skills that they will need to become community leaders in their own right. And then they would also become involved in projects, and they would be mentored throughout the programme, so that in 3 years' time, hopefully we will have at least another 16 people out there who are able to step forward and work for their communities and articulate the needs of their communities. And it's a sort of a cumulative process, in that once we get it up and running, then we will try and recruit other young people in. So it's a constant process of other people coming in, young people coming in, being trained up to become community leaders in their own right. We're also doing work at the moment on shared history. And that's basically with an eye to the celebrations or the commemorations that will be coming up for 1912 to 1922. And that involves all sorts of things, study of the United Irishmen. We would take, as we did before Christmas, trips down to Dublin and show the areas of Dublin which have a strong Protestant and Unionist influence as well as Republican influence. So we would take people along to the likes of Trinity College, which is one of the foremost colleges and universities in Ireland, and that was set up basically as an Anglican college. And it was only in latter years that Catholics actually attended Trinity, and it worked both ways. I mean, the Catholic Church didn't let them go either; they forbid them to go. We would take them to Island Bridge, which is the largest memorial garden in the British Isles for those who died in World War I. Take them to Grange-Gorman Cemetery, where there are a lot of soldiers, ex-soldiers buried, British soldiers, Australian soldiers, and that's a military graveyard. And there's a very interesting one in there, actually. the grave of a guy called Martin Doyle, VC. And this is where our shared history comes in. Martin Doyle was, I think, from Waterford, and he fought in the British Army and was awarded the VC, the Victoria Cross, which is the highest honour that you can get. And when he went across to receive his VC, he was the intelligence officer of the West Clare Brigade of the IRA. Worked that one out. And then he worked, I think, as a security guard or something in Guinness for a while. In the Civil War, I think he fought on the side of the pro-treaty side, and his dying wish was to be buried as a British soldier. That's what we mean about shared history. It's a guy who was both in the IRA and in the British Army. And then we would look at the likes of Glasnevin, which is the cemetery. We're obsessed with cemeteries, aren't we? it's graves, which would where you would find there would be buried all the great Irish patriots, like Daniel O'Connell. I was going to say Daniel O'Donnell there for a minute, the singer. Daniel O'Connell, Eamon de Valera, Michael Collins. You know, they're all buried in the graveyard, and just take people down to see that. So there's a lot of our history is shared. I mean, even the modern republicanism sort of stems from the United Irishmen of 1798, the rebellion. And you know, it's only in relatively recent years that I started to pay any attention to the United Irishmen, because the vast bulk of them were Presbyterians, and the Presbyterians were actually treated in the same way as the native Catholics. The Church of England, the Anglicans, actually ran Ireland, and at the time Presbyterians weren't allowed to hold public office, they weren't allowed to vote, and they weren't allowed to hold that. So that's a big part of our shared history. You know, Theobald Wolfe-Tone, who's looked upon as the father of modern day republicanism, was actually a Protestant. And in the north, Henry Joy McCracken, he was one of the leaders of the 1798 rebellion, was a Presbyterian.
Librarian.
A librarian. That was
hanged.
Thomas Russell, I think, was the librarian. But he was hanged in
Cornmarket.
Cornmarket, yeah. So this is our shared history, so there's nothing black and white.
I know there are a lot of questions out here that, you know, whether the walls in Belfast are ever going to come down and whether schools are ever going to be integrated. Who'd like to start?
Let me hand this over.
Sure.
Lady had a question before the break.
Okay.
Hi.
Just kind of tying into what you're talking about, I was wondering if you could walk us through what a typical day at your job is like. You talked about some of the initiatives that you're working on, and also where does the funding come from for the BCRS? And finally, do you worry about your safety with your work and just living in Belfast? How actively is that a part of your life?
Right, okay. There wouldn't be a typical day. I mean, that sounds a bit trite, and I suppose everybody says that, but there really isn't a typical day, because you really respond to the needs and the demands of the communities and the areas in which we work, and they can change day and daily. I mean, I could go in to work on a Monday, you know, expecting an easy day of it. And there could have been something happen, some antisocial behaviour or whatever, maybe had trouble after a parade or something like that, which would change your whole week, and suddenly you have to leave what you're doing and focus on that. So there really is no such thing as a typical day. But I mean, a lot of it would be, I and my colleagues now try and spend as little time as we possibly can behind a desk. Now, with funding, this sort of leads into your other question. The demands of funders now are greater than they were at the start. When Peace 3 came out, literally money was thrown at groups, and there wasn't a great deal of...
I was going to say, you may want to mention what Peace 3...
Oh yes, see, so Peace 1, Peace 2, we now into Peace 3 are the funding streams which have been put in to build the peace process in Northern Ireland and the border counties of Monaghan, Cavan and Donegal as well in the Republic. The money comes from Europe, it's EU money. So their demands for reporting and financial controls and all have gone from being very slack to being extremely tight. But we try and spend as little time as possible behind our desks, because if you're behind your desk, you're not really doing your work. You're out in the communities and you're listening to what the community's needs and wants and aspirations are. Funding, our project is funded by the SEUPB, which is the Special European Union Promotions Board, which is a bit of a mouthful. Our funding ends in October of this year, so I may not be here any longer. But we've put in an application for funding for another 3 years, and we think, well, we would like to believe that we have a case that the work is still very much work in progress, and we're hopeful that we can get funding for another 3 years. Am I worried? No. About travelling in Belfast? No, not really. No more than, probably any other city that, you get mugged, I suppose. Mugged in London once. The dissidents are a threat, and a couple of weeks ago, probably a couple of months ago, they put out a threat against a community worker in West Belfast who was a Republican, actually quite a high-profile Republican, and then they very generously enlarged that to all community workers, which I thought was big of them. How serious it is, I have no idea. I really don't know how serious it is, but I would be out in Republican areas for meetings day and daily, just as my colleagues would be in and out of Unionist areas, and there's no threat, not that I'm aware of. No more than there would be in any other normal society.
A couple more questions here.
I was wondering, with your involvement in community action, what have you noticed the differences are between youth gangs of the past, like in relation to during the mid-'70s, and the youth gangs of present, and what their drive and motivation was in joining gangs, whether it was a paramilitary drive formerly, and now with the lack of motivation to join paramilitaries as compared to the 70s, is it more of just drugs or just a lack of direction? And also I was wondering if you knew any differences between Protestant youth involvement in gangs presently and Catholic youth.
Good questions.
Good question. Youth generally is a problem at the moment. The trouble, any trouble we have at interfaces now, it's not orchestrated. There is no paramilitary involvement. In fact, the paramilitaries would come out and try and stop it. It's young people, and some of them are young as 8 and 9 and 10 years of age, and a lot of it is down to boredom, because the facilities and provision for young people in our intercity and interface communities is nowhere near adequate to the need, and the young people get bored. And there's a term that's used, again it's become a bit of a cliche, but it is actually true. It's recreational rioting. It's when I dabbled with paramilitarism in very early days, there was a bit of excitement to what was a rather ordinary, mundane life, and these kids do indulge in recreational rioting, and in many ways the efforts that you make to do cross-community work with young people comes back to haunt you, because you take them away for weekends, maybe Outward Bound or whatever conferences, personal development conferences or whatever, and they all get on like a house on fire. It's wonderful. And then they exchange mobile phone numbers. So when they get back home, they phone each other up and say, look, do you fancy a riot at 5:30 tonight across in Lanark Way? And that actually does happen. It is recreational rioting. It's probably underpinned by an element of sectarianism, but basically when you talk to them rationally, you sit down, it's boredom. There's nothing else to do. We would operate mobile phone networks where activists in both sides of the interfaces have each other's phone numbers, and we would use that to try and prevent these things, intervention work, and try and prevent them happening, or in worst case, if they do flare up, they can get activists there fairly quickly to try and break it up and move the young people along. But what you're doing really is you're moving the problem, you're shifting the problem away from one interface to another area. A big problem with youth, because they do feel so disconnected, and there is very, very little provision for them. An example of that would be in the Lower Shankill. The council-owned youth club is opened a couple of nights a week when they can get the resources to get a dedicated youth worker in. Youth work is very specialist work. I keep well out of it because I don't have the skills, nor do I have the patience, I think, anymore for it. But it is very, very dedicated and very specialist work. And they close the centre sometimes in the summer if they haven't got people to open it. The centre would be closed in the summer, so the kids are off school. So the boredom that they have is just increased, you know, and inflamed. We got an outreach worker in, it was about 2 years ago, to work part-time in the Lower Shankill. And this guy is a friend of mine, and he's a brilliant guy, dedicated, very skilled, very experienced. And he started working in the streets with the kids and talking to them and trying to get them involved into programs and activities. And the funding ran out after 6 months, and they moved him on somewhere else. So not only was all the work that he did wasted, but the credibility with the young people is gone, because the next time somebody comes in, they'll go, oh sure, you'll only be here for 3 or 4 months anyway, or 6 months. What's the point? So you have that. You have a lot of the interface areas. The kids never leave. The young people never leave the area. I mean, we have young people who very, very rarely wander outside of the Lower Shankill, and the Lower Shankill is a very small community. So their whole life just revolves around the one area. Any time that we're doing activities, or if we're taking them away maybe for a residential or a conference, I deliberately try and take them out to the sea or to the mountains or to a hotel or a youth club or something that's out of the area, just so to get them out of the area and to let them see that the world's a bigger place than the Lower Shankill. But it is a big problem. Drugs, there's no more, I mean, drugs, Bill and I talked about this today, drugs is a societal problem. You know, it's not confined to working class communities by any stretch of the imagination. One of the television stations about 2 years ago did this program about drug abuse, and they went into a lot of the top hotels and restaurants in Belfast and Greater Belfast area and took swabs in the toilets and found tremendous residues of cocaine and stuff like that, you know. So drugs has got nothing really specific to do with working class areas. In the Lower Shankill, the paramilitaries do not sell drugs. I know that for a fact. And the people who are in power at the moment would be very anti-drugs. But drugs, as I said, is a societal problem. Young people will buy them. And all they do, there's no heavy drugs. They smoke dope. Some of them would smoke dope. But I mean, I have friends who smoke dope. Probably get me. New York, Guantanamo Bay, here I come.
Yeah.
I don't.
Right.
So if investors are so hesitant to invest in industry right now, then what really can be done about unemployment?
We have a problem, and it's particularly relevant at the moment because of the cuts, you know, the cutbacks, because with the recession, and something like 70% of people employed in Northern Ireland work for the government in some form or fashion. They're civil servants in some form or fashion. That could be civil servants, police, councils, prison officers, whatever. That's not healthy. It was healthy in a way in that when things were good, you know, those jobs were guaranteed and the money was flowing into the economy, into the shops and restaurants and pubs and bars and so forth. And, you know, on the basis that as long as the government didn't go bust, then that money would still be available. But now we've heavy, severe cuts in all of the government departments, so that money is disappearing as well. We had too great a reliance on the public sector, and everyone knows it, but up until now, no one has really made any tremendous efforts to try and address it. But, you know, necessity changes things. We do have investors. I mean, we do have outside companies, but my personal view of outsiders coming in. But we have been stung very badly in the past by foreign companies coming in and eating up all the grants and then closing the doors and disappearing off. I would rather see us grow our own economy, our indigenous economy, and try and build that. And maybe even if it is smaller, much smaller businesses, then they're sustainable and they're going to stay. They've got a stake, they've got roots in the community. We have the likes of Bombardier, for example, which was Short Brothers, which is now owned by their French-Canadian or a Canadian company, and they're a massive employer. In fact, they've got some new orders in there worth like a lot of millions of pounds, so they'll be taking on a lot more workers. But again, we feel vulnerable that we could all waken up someday and Bombardier have decided to relocate to, I don't know, Outer Mongolia or wherever. So peace will bring its own dividend, and you know the politicians are over in America and Europe quite a lot trying to invest and get investors to come and look at Northern Ireland, and had support from politicians like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, who's always been a great a great friend of Northern Ireland and Ireland generally. And I think once we bed down the piece, then our offer, our proposition will be much stronger, to attract investment. But personally, I would rather see more effort put in to try and grow our own our own indigenous businesses.
Rachel?
Thank you for coming. I'm Irish.
Good to be here.
You're
Which
welcome.
part? County Kerry? No.
It's my family.
Donegal?
I don't live there. Haven't been there. I would like to go, but from one side of my family, they're from, I believe, Northern Ireland. I'm not sure exactly, but I'm very interested in finding out further. My question to you is, I'm a criminal justice criminology major, as well as political science. And I really am very interested in your leadership program that you are forging ahead, and wondering if you could give a website address if you have one. I would like to be able to follow you. But I'm very pro, I'm a firm believer that money starts in the private sector. Public sector is funded by that. And so I'm very huge on, and I don't see a lot of this happening, not only at K through 12, or probably would be high school level, but also in the collegiate level, of teaching people how to think like entrepreneurs. Whether it's a big corporation or you have small, privately owned, I think that's very important, because if you have that, it's something that they own, and it helps them. And I would like to have you speak more to that issue, if you could, and give your your website address out too, if you have
Yep, sure,
one.
I can do that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, the third sector, which is the social economy sector. Yeah, that's the timing of your question is actually first class, because I'm at Georgetown University at the moment doing another degree in community development. One of the modules we're looking at the moment is social economy, citizenship in the social economy. Yeah, we're all very aware of this, and we're all very aware of sustainability, and we're all very aware that funding will dry up. I mean, Europe, we're now in, pardon me, we're now in Peace 3 funding, and when it dries up, we know ourselves that will be the end of money coming in from Europe. They feel that they've probably put enough into what is a very, very small country, and the money will probably go into other countries in Europe. I don't know if Bulgaria and Romania and so forth come in. I mean, they need a lot of development. So we're very aware that funding will dry up, and we have looked at the social economy. There are some very successful social economy projects in Belfast. One would be the Ashton Centre in the New Lodge Road, which I think employ about 80 odd people in different businesses. We put a proposal about 2 years ago. There was a block of derelict flats in the Lower Shankill, known as Malvern Flats, and in the bad old days it was a drug distribution centre, so it blighted the area and it sent out a bad signal, and we wanted the flats knocked down, and we managed to get a few people to work with us, and we got a firm of accountants and business planners to put together a business proposition for this piece of land. And we wanted to build offices for ourselves, because our offices were being knocked down at the time, to make way for a health and wellbeing centre. We wanted a visitor centre, because there are about 2.6 million visitors to West Belfast, tourists that come to West Belfast every year. And on the Shankill Road, we really have no way we have no offers that will get them to stay in the area and spend money in the area. And we think, because we're so close to the city centre and we're on the route, there's a tremendous opportunity there for a visitor centre. We were talking about putting in maybe budget accommodation, because a lot of the people who would visit West Belfast would be young people, backpackers, students like that, who can't afford the hotel rates. So we thought of being within 5 minutes of the city centre. Again, the location is perfect for that. And we put together a very reasoned business case, and we put it into the housing executive, and it just disappeared into the ether. But we haven't given up. The flats, the first thing that's happened is those flats have been demolished, and we will be going back to the housing executive again to see if we can try and get some movement there. But we are very aware that we must become more involved and set up social enterprises, because that's the only thing that will sustain the work that we do. Our funding is up at the end of October, as I said. If worst case scenario we're not funded, then I can't afford to do what I do. I mean, it costs me about £180 a month in petrol alone to travel up and down to Belfast every day. And most of my colleagues would be in the same boat. So if the funding is not renewed, then a lot of the work that we do will just stop, it'll finish. And it's still very much work in progress. There's still much more work for us to be done. So the simple answer is yes, we're looking at opportunities to try and develop social enterprises. And we're looking at opportunities where we can maybe form alliances, and even to the point where we can deliver services at the sharp end, at the coalface, for the likes of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive or for the City Council, and take on service provision for them. It's difficult. It's just difficult. It's difficult raising the capital, and it's difficult getting the support. But that's not to say it can't be done.
We have another question.
Oh, right. Okay. I was wondering how much, if at all, do parents take responsibility for the dropout rate and their kids joining paramilitary groups and gangs, or do they just kind of blame the government for that and the educational system rather than themselves and their perpetuating attitudes about us and them?
That's actually a very, very good question. I don't think the parents take enough. The simple answer, I don't think they take enough responsibility. Not a lot, but a significant number of families in the Lower Shankill and other inner city areas would be dysfunctional. I mean, we would have quite a high percentage of single parents in the area who struggle to bring up their children. Also, the learned experiences of the children, come into play. Some of them are coming from families where there may be, 2-3 generations now of unemployment. So their mindsets are not geared towards education, and there's no value in education. The families put no value in education, and that learning is passed on to their children. In terms of antisocial behaviour, I mean, we would go and tell parents that they need to look after their children. If we find their children out causing trouble and involved in antisocial behaviour, we would go and we would tell the parents. More often than not, the parents take it on board and try and control them, but some of the parents just don't bother and deny it. I mean, it's nothing to do with my Johnny, you're picking on him, you're always picking on him. He's been here all the time, he was never out of the house. We know fine right, he's been up to his neck in all sorts of mischief. But that's a symptom again of not just the Lower Shankill, but it's a symptom of poverty, and it's a symptom of generational poverty. It's a symptom of generational unemployment, where there's been no value placed in education, and even more than that, a lot of the young people feel that education is it's beyond them. It's a sort of thing that nice middle-class kids do. They go to university, and they would feel intimidated, and they would feel it's not welcome. Now, I've tried to change that, and we've been doing work with Jordanstown, a lecturer down there who lectures in the built environment, and they've been coming and talking. Their students have been coming and talking to us on community planning and consultation, and trying to get the perspectives of the community in planning. And I've taken our young people down to the university and try and let them see that it's not a hotbed of middle class kids with nice accents and a lot of money, that there are working class kids there as well. But sometimes it's like trying to get them to go to the moon. There are these barriers there, and it's maybe a generational thing, but it is very, very difficult to break through it, and a lot of it is just learned.
Follow up on that?
Shout.
Do you think maybe, since it's been going on for so long, that the parents might, I understand that they don't put any value in it now, but do you think maybe, they could just try it out, test it out, and see if maybe if we do put a little value in it and get the kids to school, that it might change the situation that's happening right now? Or if you educated the parents more instead of just taking the kids to see that the other schools aren't just middle class, that maybe that might help the parents tell the kids, hey, you could go.
Yeah. I think once we make a breakthrough, and we will eventually make a breakthrough, then that'll send out a signal. Well, if Johnny can do it, I can do it. If your son can do it, my son can do it. I'll just tell you a story, if you don't mind, that I think illustrates that. My oldest son, Chris, went to Royal Belfast Academic Institution, which sounds very posh and all, but it's a grammar school in Belfast. It's a very, very good grammar school. And when Chris was there, one of his best mates, Andy, I think Andy came from the Upper Shankill, and he and Chris were good pals. And Andy had visited our house, and Chris had visited his house, and so on. And just before they did their GCSEs, Andy left. And he left because of peer pressure. He left because where he lived on the Shankill Road, his pals and his peers made fun of him. They called him a sissy because he studied and he wore a school uniform and he played rugby and didn't play football, and he stayed in at night and did homework instead of going out in the streets. And because of that peer pressure, he dropped out of Inst. Now, my son Chris is now a PhD working in UCD, University College in Dublin. And that young lad, Andy, had the same ability, the same academic ability, I have no doubt, as my son. But his circumstances and his environment were different. And that was the difference between the two of them. There was no support. Not only was there no support, he was made fun of. He was taunted, and he was made fun of by his pals because he was a sissy, because he studied and he went to jail. Now, in many ways, that's a Protestant thing, a phenomenon. There's a feeling goes around. There used to be a bit of graffiti in Belfast, West Belfast. I hope you understand this, but it said, when the prods were drinking, the tags were thinking. And there's actually an element in that, because I'd said to you before that the Protestant working class basically had jobs in heavy industry, and you followed your father in, and the Catholics didn't have those jobs. So the Catholic population embraced education. And we are far behind them in that now. And the number of young kids going around, young Catholic kids at university and going to good grammar schools and going to university is much, and working class, much higher in Catholic areas than it is in Protestant areas. If I drive up the Falls Road any day about 3 o'clock, the place is chock-a-block with young kids coming out of St Genevieve's grammar school, St Mary's College. There must be about 4 grammar schools on the Falls Road, good grammar schools, tremendous reputations, and the kids are all coming out in their school uniforms. And if I drive up and do a U-turn and drive down the Shankill Road, I probably won't see one kid or one young person, and certainly won't see them in uniform. There's different mindsets. A friend of mine comes from the Lower Falls, and he's one of a family of 12, and the whole family got degrees. Charlie's the same age as himself. The whole family got degrees. And I remember him telling me about his grandmother. And his grandmother was a wee widow who wore black all the time, you know, and she lived in his house, and she lived on a pension, a state pension, and every week or every fortnight when she got her pension in, she put the money aside for the rent and the heat and the food and a bit of clothing and her funeral. Funerals are big things. And whatever was left went into a jam pot, and that sat in the mantelpiece, and that was for her grandchildren's education. And Charlie said they used to go around and divvy it up. It was only a few pence, but it just shows you the mindset and the thinking. That doesn't happen in Protestant working class areas. So we have a bit to go. I think once we break the mould and once we get a few kids, a few young people into education, I think then that'll send out a signal to others that, you know, well, if John can do it, I can do it. And, you know, that might then start a wee bit of a momentum. But it's making that initial breakthrough, which is the hard thing.
I just had a quick question, then we have another one here in the audience, but this relates to the peace walls.
That had to come, yeah.
A topic that obviously had to come up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one that we talked about even a little bit last night. But the fact is that we take a look at the peace walls today. I think there's something like 84, 88 peace walls. And I just want to read this to you. This was a quote from the Community Relations Council Executive, Duncan Morrow.
And Duncan, yeah.
You know?
And this is in response to another peace wall that just went up 2 months ago in Derry.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're
Yeah.
A 170-meter fence at a playing field had been constructed. And his response is, "It is always a tragedy when real concerns about personal safety drive local communities to the conclusion that only a physical barrier can provide security. Council, the CRC recognizes the needs for safety of all people. However, we are also concerned that the erection of barriers should be seen as a temporary intervention which indicates deeper underlying issues which need to be tackled if these barriers are not to be permanent divisions. Could you take a few minutes, Brian, to speak to that?
Good question.
I would agree entirely with Duncan's response. I would agree 100% with it. At the moment, everybody's obsessed with the walls. We've actually more peace walls now than we did during the height of the Troubles, for whatever reason. And the good and the great are obsessed with the peace walls, about bringing them down, and there are all sorts of groups now that have been set up, working groups and so forth, to look at ways of bringing the peace walls down. They're dreadful things. I mean, they really are dreadful things. But I take the view that the peace walls, I think it concurs with what Duncan said, the peace walls are the symptom. The peace walls aren't the problem. The peace walls are the symptom of the divisions. They're a symptom of the fear and the mistrust that still exists in these communities. And the peace walls will not come down. They will not come down until the interfaith communities feel safe and secure enough to bring them down themselves. And that takes us full circle now into what I was saying earlier about development. More money must be put into the development of the interfaith communities where these peace walls are. Some of these peace walls, I mean, literally the communities on either side could be 50 metres from each other. If you took the wall down, you'd be looking across at an expanse of no more than 50 metres to people who should be neighbours. These people should be neighbours. They should be going out to work in the morning and bidding each other the time of day and waving over at each other. They should be going in and out each other's houses. You know, it's that fear, and that hasn't happened. So if you take the peace walls down now, they'll be looking across at strangers. They'll be looking across at complete strangers. And there's not a great deal of work being done. There's a lot of the academics and the liberals and the well-meaning people are debating the peace walls at the moment. But there doesn't seem to be any great effort made to talk to the people who live in these communities butted right up against the peace walls. There's a few pieces of research has been done. One was the American lady, can't remember her name, but she was fairly high up the pecking order. I think at one stage she'd been an advisor to Ted Kennedy. And she came over and she got some of us from both sides of the peace wall, from the Falls Road and the Shankill down, to talk to us about it. And she wanted us to take down one of the peace walls to mark the 10th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And we thought, oh, that's wonderful. I mean, that is absolutely wonderful. Don't worry about the people who live there. You know, just let's have this symbolic thing of knocking down a peace wall, and just to keep, you know, to mark an anniversary. And she said they were conducting some surveys with the people who live in the interfaith communities. And I said, look, counterpart Jerry on the other side said the same thing. I can save you £60,000. I can tell you exactly what the survey will tell you. The survey will tell you that the vast bulk of people would like to see the peace walls down, but not today, thank you very much. And not trying to be smart, but that's what come out. 74% of the residents of the interfaith community says yes, they would like the peace walls down, but not today, thank you very much, not in the foreseeable future. So the peace walls are the symptom. They are the symptom. And until money is put in to regenerate the people who live in these interfaith communities, and to build relationships with them, you know, the peace walls will stay there.
Katrina.
I have a question regarding what you said before about the schools. I mean, do you see a solution in integrating the schools? I mean, there are a few schools I've learned that are integrated. Is that a future? Is that a future that people will stay in school? And then my second question is about integrating communities. I mean, what would you suggest is the solution? I mean, what are ways to start integrating neighborhoods, integrating communities?
Start with the schools, yes. I think if you, and I'm an example of that, and I referred at the very start about my friend Kieran and I, who grew up together, and Kieran went to the local Catholic school, I went to the local Protestant school, and that made us aware of difference. If we had gone to the same school, it probably wouldn't have been an issue. I think if you separate young people, if you separate children at 6 years of age, and that's when kids start going to school in Northern Ireland, then immediately you've planted into their minds that they're different. And educating them in separate schools through their primary education and through their grammar school or secondary school education just reinforces that about difference. Now, I know that on both sides, the Catholic I think it's something for maintained schools, the management committee for Catholic maintained schools. They want the Catholic faith to be promoted in their schools, and they want their young people to be brought up in a Catholic ethos. And in the Protestant side, the likes of the Free Presbyterians, for example, they would have their own schools where the children are brought up in their particular ethos. So it's not an easy one, but my personal belief is that if you separate children at a young age, you can never undo that damage. There's always a feeling of difference, and I can vouch for that because that's what happened to myself. And my personal view is that, and this will cause a few ructions when I get back home, that there's no place for religion in schools. Religion and faith should be a personal thing. It should be taught in the home, not in schools. When I went to school, we had a service every morning at 10 to 9, and me and my pals and I did our best to get out of it. We used to, rather than go to the service, we used to slip around to the bicycle sheds and have a cigarette. At 9 years of age, it wasn't quite 9. Then we would have maybe in the week, school week, we would maybe have 2 classes of religious instruction, and most of the teachers had as much interest in teaching us religious instruction as we had learning it. So most of the teachers just let you do your homework. Occasionally you got the odd Bible thumper who insisted in, pushing it down your throat, but by and large we stayed well out of it. I personally believe that faith and religion is a personal thing. It should be taught in home, and it should be kept well out of schools. Other questions a bit more difficult about how, again, this is another obsession about getting integrated communities, and the argument is both financial and it's also driven by what is a normal society. I wouldn't be as obsessed about it as a lot of people, in that ghettos, if you like, exist all over the world. When I worked in London, the Irish all lived, not all of them, but they all congregated around Kilburn, the Kilburn area of North London. And that's where they had their pubs and their clubs, and the Australians all congregated and lived down, I think, around the Earl's Court Road. And you get that in other cities in Britain, with Muslim areas, largely Muslim areas, largely, I don't know, coloured areas, largely Chinese areas or whatever. The one thing that can't be done is introduce some sort of social engineering, because that'll just upset the apple cart completely. If people are happy to live in communities where everyone is of the same religion, well, do they not have the right to do that? That's the first question. Who am I to tell someone that they have to live in a mixed area? Is the first thing. The second thing is, if it's going to change, let it change at its own speed and its own pace, when people feel confident enough and comfortable enough to move out. The government had an experiment there, I think about a year or so ago, when they built a new development down in Enniskillen in County Fermanagh, and this was meant to be a bit of a model where people were going to put in there of both religions, working class people. This is a working class phenomenon, by the way. The middle class mix comfortably, thank you very much. They don't have any problems in the Malone Road or Kiltraw about their next door neighbours. It's a working class thing. If it's going to change, it'll change at its own pace and its own time, when the people feel confident enough about it. But we also must remember too, talking about the middle class, they now live in gated communities. The numbers of developments that I see up around Belfast and other towns of very nice middle class houses or apartments, and most of them now are built with gates to keep people out. And is that not the equivalent of a peace wall? In many ways, it's designed there to keep people apart. It's designed obviously for security reasons, but nevertheless, they're gated communities. So it's affecting the middle class now as much as the working class. People, again, the good and the great, become obsessed about people living in ghettos, and I would just reiterate: who am I to judge, or who am I to tell someone where they should or where they should not live? Leave them alone. Let them work it out in their own time. If we build in the peace and build in what we have, and we do attract investments, and we get more money in, and there's more jobs created, then I think people are more inclined to move into other areas and to mix. But don't try and force them. Do not try and impose some form of social engineering, because it will just not work.
You may have just kind of answered it, but my question is, as far as getting some kind of cross-community cohesion or working together or some type of thing to take these walls down and to get people to understand each other better. What do you think is the best way that they can try to do that, and what do you think is the biggest barrier to do that?
We do work together, but at the moment, most of the engagement, if you like, the cross-community engagement is with activists. So I would be meeting with my opposite numbers in Republican and nationalist communities, people who are, like myself, they are paid development workers. We're now all looking at how we can get actually residents of these areas to meet and to talk and to enter into some sort of dialogue. I'm a great believer in keeping things simple, and we can build models and we can build theories around peace building and conflict. But in simple terms, what I believe works is dialogue. Sounds very simple, but I've seen it, and it's happened to me, that we demonize people, we demonize each other, and we're guilty of stereotyping. But when you see people sit down for the first time together from different communities, and they start to talk about the commonality and what they have in common rather than what divides them, and basically what they have in common is the outworking of their class. They have problems with jobs, with education, they have problems putting food on the table, keeping a roof over their heads. Then you find that they have common interests. They're interested in football, they're interested in rugby, they support Manchester United, blah, 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 blah. And they start talking to get into some sort of dialogue. And then that's when they see the humanity in the other person. So the other person no longer has horns and a cloven hoofs and a tail, but they're human beings, imperfect as we all are. They're none of us perfect human beings. But they see the humanity, and I think that's when you can really start and build and get people to engage and get them to look at the commonalities and what binds them rather than what separates them.
I'm just curious, what examples of evidence do you see that it's working? The commonality. And then I'll...
Right. You should know better than ask me a hard question. I'll give you a good example. We run a project at the moment called the VETS Project, Veterans, short for Veterans. And I think it stands for something like Veterans Engaging and Talking or something. I can't remember what it is. But basically what it's made up of was, from our community, we have an organisation called the Royal Irish Combined Services Old Comrades Association. And that's made up of old soldiers who served in Irish regiments as part of the British Army. And on the other side, through friends and contacts of ours, their opposite number are some of the veterans from the IRA campaign, the Operation Harvest campaign in the late 50s and 60s. And these guys are all of a similar age, but obviously totally different political outlooks and aspirations. Our guys fought for the British Army, and their guys fought to drive the British Army out. And we bring them together in residentials, and they get on like a house on fire. And they recognise each other as old soldiers, and they meet and talk as old soldiers. And they tell funny stories. And I mean, basically, when we started to do it, and there are friends of ours who, in the Falls Road, the Glantara Cultural and Historical Society facilitated on the Republican side. And we first brought these guys together. I know they're in their 70s, but we can see, people getting their heads knocked off with walking sticks and Zimmer frames and things like that happening. And they really do go on like a house on fire, to the point where we just leave them to it. We go to the bar and have a few beers and let them talk away. And they talk as old soldiers, and they tell old stories. They tell war stories to each other, and some of the stories are absolutely hilarious, And what we've done now is we've started to record them, because old people have a habit of dying, And we're trying to get some of these old stories down before they do pass, drop off their mortal coils. And some of the stories are horrendous. I mean, not horrendous, they are so incredible. Like, a lot of the guys in the old IRA, you must remember in the 50s and 60s, with no internet, with no telephones, very few cars, So they set off in an operation, and they maybe take a rifle with them and tramp over fields for days and sleep in safe houses or sleep in barns. And some of these guys are from Uri, which is right up on the border. And they would have worked with Protestants who were members of the B Specials. Have you heard of the B Specials, the old constabulary, which were 100%? And these guys would have worked together. And then the guys in the IRA said, well, we're going out now and we're going to shoot up Newry police station. But for God's sake, don't be hurting anybody, because Billy's on duty tonight, and he's my next door neighbour, and I work with him in the factory, And they tell all these super stories. And I mean, on our side, there's a guy, his nickname's Dog Medine. And the guy was, after a while, he said, why are you called the Dog? And what happened was he was in the British Army and they were in Cyprus, I think it was. And he was on guard duty one night, and they had the dogs, the police, the army dogs, and they were all barking, kicking up a fuss. And the major came along. He said, "For God's sake, McDine, shut those dogs up. The men can't get to sleep." So he shot them. He shot 12 dogs. A bit extreme, And these guys you go in and they're tripping over each other. The tears are streaming down their faces. But they should have been real enemies. They should have been real enemies. And I mean, I've talked to people, for example, in Carrickhill, which is the Republican area just below the Lower Shankill. And it's divided by the West Link, by the motorway. And some of those guys would have told us that when they were growing up in that area, they would actually have helped collect for the bonfires on the 11th of July night, which is the big Protestant celebration. And they felt part of it, and they would have helped collect the bonfires for the bonfire. And they would have come out on the next day and watched the parades as the Orangemen walked by. And they're starting... All these stories come out, and it just brings out the humanity and, pardon me, the commonality about it. And it's as simple as dialogue. Just get them. The hard bit's getting people to sit down, because when we said there are a lot about meeting the veterans of the IRI campaign, we're not going to talk to those guys. And no doubt they said exactly the same thing. But then when you got them together, it's unbelievable.
Let's take one more question here, and then we'll round up for the evening.
Well, first I wanted to say that was the first time I've ever heard of anything like that. But I've seen it in other conflicts where you see, enemies on opposite sides, like finding that commonality and the mutual respect for each other, just out of the kind of commonality that you get, forged in combat. And so I thought that was really interesting that you shared that, and I think that could have a real future, like you were saying, with recordings and sharing that with both sides, people who couldn't bring themselves out of pride or tradition to sit down with, people from the opposite side. I think those recordings would really be interesting. I had a question back on education. We saw, like in America, we had the push to get parents and single moms back into schools. And I was wondering if a similar type of from top to bottom method in educating the parents and therefore creating a more positive social construct for bringing their kids up. Is there any effort to get adults in Northern Ireland further educated?
At community level, I mean, we run classes all the time, and although we can only accommodate probably maybe 12, 14 people at a time, but we would when we can source funding, we would run classes we've ran classes, for example, in drugs awareness for young people who were using a lot of marijuana and were becoming paranoid, and we had big problems in the area, as happens right across Belfast and working class areas, with young men committing suicide, and we ran that. We ran a very successful course about 2 years ago in tourism, training people to be proper tourist guides, and we put 5 people eventually finished that. It was done through the Belfast Visitor and Welcome Centre, and these 5 young people now are trained guides. So when people come to the community and they want to go around and have a look at the murals and learn a bit about the social and political history of the area, we send these young people out. And we asked about the social economy. We're trying to help them formalise that, where they can maybe get a website and they can maybe get some money and have their own identification with fleeces, whatever, do a wee bit of promotion and try and start that as a small business. So we would run them, and where we would see a demand, we got people coming to us a while back as well and asking about first aid, for example, if they could learn the basics of first aid. And we managed to get a wee bit of funding, and we put that in. And often when we aren't able to get funding, there's enough goodwill out there that we can go and get somebody who has that special expertise, and they'll come and do it for nothing. There is a lot of goodwill in the community. Numbers, by and large, are small. They're very small. we take the view that if one person comes along and completes a course, then that's one more person. I also make a point of even if the courses aren't accredited, we ask whoever delivers them to give some form of recognition, because it's amazing for people who have never had achieved anything in education what that little bit of paper can do for them. One of the girls, we did an introduction to community development about 3 years ago, and it was OCN, Open College Network Level 1, which is the first level that you can do, and there were seven people completed it, and one of the girls who completed it, we made a bit of a thing about their presentation of their certificates. You know, we brought them in and we put on some tea and sandwiches, and we got the tutor to come in and make a presentation, and we took photographs of it. Then we put the photographs in the local mirror. We hyped it up, you know, we talked it up. And her mother came in the next day and ran straight for me and hugged me. This sounds stupid, but that was because that was the first qualification that her daughter, who was late 20s, had ever got in her life, and she was so chuffed she thought she'd had a degree out of this place, you know. So yes, we try and do it. It's hard getting them out. The numbers are generally small. There's also literacy problems that you have to factor into this as well. That a lot of people out there do genuinely have problems with their reading and writing, their basic literacy, and you have to be aware of that. And some of them we've been able to get them one-to-one tuition to try and get them over that. In other cases, we have been able to get them qualified on the basis of experiential learning, where basically I will sit down and take down their verbatim. I will take down their answers, or will record it, and increasingly some of the accreditation bodies are accepting that as a recognised form of qualification. But it's slow. But once you get numbers, it's a cumulative process. You get one or two people in, and then the next time you're on it, you maybe get 3 or 4 of their pals coming in thinking, well, if Nicky got it, I can get it, because I'm every bit as smart as Nicky. You know?
Let me ask one more question, and then we'll fold up the tent. Imagine it's 10 years from now, and describe for us the political, economic, social situation, whether sectarianism is still a problem, which political party has power in Northern Ireland, whether the border is still there, and whether the people are optimistic or pessimistic about their future.
Well, I would say I'd start at the back and say I'm optimistic. We have broken the cycle. That's the main thing. We have broken the cycle. We have the dissidents to contend with, but it says in the Bible, you know, the poor you will have always. We will always have dinosaurs. We will always have dissidents. And we expect that. Hopefully they will come to their senses and see the futility of what they're doing. But I'm certainly optimistic. We've broken the cycle. More importantly, well, equally importantly, is the political parties have now agreed to share power for the first time. This is the first time this has ever happened. I mean, I was talking to Chuck, I think it was, earlier, and I was saying that our peace process has only been going for 15 years. Sometimes we need to stop and reflect and look back and stop beating ourselves up. And we do have a tendency to beat ourselves up. Our communities have come a long, long way in a relatively short period of time. And I think that we need to acknowledge that and not keep constantly beating ourselves up and giving ourselves a hard time and say, oh, we should be further on, we should be further on, the institutions should be further on, you know, the political process, the normalisation process should be further down the road. So first of all, I would be optimistic. The border, well, to a large extent, the border has disappeared. You know, I can remember, I'm old enough to remember, and it's not that long ago, when you drove from Belfast to Dublin and you stopped at the customs, and more often than not, they just waved you through. And but every now and again they stopped and looked in your boot, and I remember a number of times when they looked in my boot and relieved me of about 4 bottles of Irish whiskey that was smuggling into the south. I used to have a lucrative wee business going there. When there was a big difference between the price of spirits in the north and the south, and I used to call into a cash and carry in Uri, fill the boot of the car with vodka and whiskey, drive down to Dublin, sell them down there and make a very handsome profit. And this is
all in the past tense.
Oh yeah, this is the Presbyterian in me, you know. And normally I would have gone down late at night and it was cold and wet and they'd just wave you through. This night this guy stopped me and I remember I had a Volvo with one of those, we called it shoot and brake, we would call it an estate car with one of those things over the back, and he asked to have a look at the back, and I said, no, you don't really want to have a look at the back. And there was about, I don't know, down in the axles with drink, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and he said to me, he says, I'm a drinking man myself, I said, get away to hell. I said, would you like a bottle of Blackbush? He says, I wouldn't mind, so I gave him the bottle of Blackbush. This is on the side, and I went to pull the thing back and get in the car. He says, "But wife likes a wee drink as well." What's your wife drink? What have you got? Oh, vodka. He and I became the best of pals, And every time he saw me, we gave him first name terms and all. They were, Brian, don't tell me, bottle of Blackbush, bottle of vodka. So the border, to a large extent, is gone. I mean, as it has in Europe generally. You drive through Europe now, and there are no borders. The north-south bodies that have been set up seem to be working. With a few hiccups there, and they're starting. They need to bed that down. But by and large, the north-south bodies are working, and everybody's accepted it. The Republic of Ireland went into the euro. Britain didn't. We still have the old sterling system, but maybe sooner or later that'll happen as well. So to all extents and purposes, in many ways, we do have a united Ireland. Okay. We do have a united Ireland. The other questions were the future, the political. I said my personal view is I think we need to rethink our old concepts of republicanism, nationalism, and unionism and loyalism in the light of the changing world. We need to become more progressive, and we need to look at a new politic, which is modern and lets us still retain, our cultures and our traditions. Because I don't believe that having strong views is sectarian or that it makes you a bad person. There's nothing wrong with having strong views. In fact, I prefer dealing and meeting people who do feel passionate about what they believe in rather than people that are wishy-washy and really don't care either way. But in the absence of that, what I would like to see is at Stormont, I would like to see an opposition. Because really, the whole power sharing concept was so new, and it was designed, I think, as a form of letting our politicians learn the art of politics, learn the art of real politics, which they never had before, and how basically to govern and about governance. And we don't have an opposition. What we have really is a carve-up where the ministerial posts are dished out relative to your mandate. So at the moment the DUP is the biggest party. They have most portfolios. Second is Sinn Féin. Third is the Ulster Unionists. And fourth, I think, is the SDLP. So everybody gets some sort of share of the cake. My personal belief is that you need an opposition. A democracy needs an opposition. It needs a strong opposition so that you can keep them on their toes and make sure that there's no funny business going on and that they're focused, and what they do is always open to scrutiny and always open to challenge, because when governments and people get complacent, then that's when things go backwards. So I would like to see the people that we have in the Hill learn the art of real politics. They've made some blunders, and in many ways that you can see this lack of experience in real politics, but hopefully they'll learn fast, and hopefully someday then we will, and maybe the Ulster Unionist Party or the SDLP will get together, and they've talked about it. It's never come down, and some of them have actually advocated a step outside of this sort of carve up and become a real opposition. And what was the other question, Bill, about sectarianism?
Yeah, sectarianism.
Harder one. Yeah. There's surveys out recently that seem, pardon me, it seems to indicate that sectarianism is greater now than it was during the Troubles. Okay. Sectarianism would be particularly strong amongst young people. What I have found is the older generations and the ex-combatants are nowhere near as sectarian now as some of the young people. Yeah. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me why.
That's an important point.
It is. And some of the young people, this is another scary thing, and moving on from the question that you asked earlier about young people, a scary thing is that a lot of young people feel they've missed out in the war. That they hear the old hands sitting around in bars telling old war stories about the time they did this, the time they did that, and the time they spent in prison, and prison was great, and the camaraderie was there, and they don't tell them about the hard men crying and the broken families and the children that never saw their fathers. I mean, a friend of mine, I was telling the Bill earlier, his wife was pregnant and 2 months from giving birth, and he went out to collect the buggy. And come back 5 years later. Police were looking for him, scooped him, ended up in jail. And so he came back, he had a 5-year-old daughter who didn't know him. didn't know him, complete stranger. Young people feel that they've missed out. I remember when the 2 soldiers were killed, I don't know if you remember this, by the dissidents in Antrim. And I was in the office on the Monday morning, and I was out the back having a smoke, as is my wont, and a cup of coffee. And this young lad came bounding round the corner, must have been about 22, 23. And he said, Brian, what do you think of the 2 soldiers being killed at the weekend? I said, it was dreadful. It's a terrible, terrible thing. He says, right, that's it, back to war. I said, Robert, back to war? Where does this back to war come from? You're 22 years of age. You were 7 when peace broke out. I mean, you must have been some operator at 7 years of age. And he said, right, we're going to get attack who? Attack who? Republicans, nothing to do with Republicans. This was dissidents, This mindset that they'd actually missed out on something. And what a lot of the prisoners groups now are doing, the ex-prisoners groups, and there's quite a few of them around, is they're actually sitting down and talking to kids and telling them, it's not nice in jail. You really don't want to go to jail. It's not nice. They've had opportunities where they've taken them actually up to Crumlin Road prison, and they've locked them in a cell for 8 hours. Just locked them and left them. With, their agreement. They don't obviously just pay you in there for, or go down to the pub, we'll see in 8 hours' time. And the kids have been in there for 8 hours, and suddenly, whoa, I don't want this. So that's sort of changing as well. But there is this, and it's really worrying these young people who feel that on both sides, they feel they've lost out. A lot of the dissidents at the moment are recruiting young people. And I've seen them marching in the Falls Road, and they're kids with baseball caps and hoods and all. I mean, they're youngsters. They're angry. They're angry young people. And because they're angry and they're disconnected and they hate the world and they've no visions, they've no dreams, they've no aspirations, they're easy pickings, they're fodder. And what these young people have to get through to them is that they're going to go to jail. They're going to go to jail, or they're going to get killed if they follow this road into this sort of mindless republicanism that has no philosophy. They have no strategic views, they've no political aspirations, they've nothing going for them. These young people are going to end up in serious trouble, they're going to end up in jail, and then they'll come out of jail and be even more bitter and twisted. And somehow somebody has to get through to them and tell them this is the reality. They're being used, they're the fodder,
In closing, I'd like to remind you something I expect you already knew, and that is that Brian Watson came all the way from Belfast to appear before you folks. And I want you to give him a round of applause to let him know
Thank you very much.
it was worth the trip. Thank you, Brian. Thank you.
Anybody going down to the pub?
They're ready. Good, thank you.
It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Some hard questions.
Yeah. Some good questions.
Well answered. Good questions.
Yeah,
Good questions.
very well.